I'm William. I'm 70 years old. I spent 40 years of my life turning dirt and concrete into a multi-million-dollar construction empire. I built skyscrapers. I built hospitals. I built the very foundation this city stands on. But the hardest lesson I ever learned, the one that nearly broke me, didn't happen on a construction site. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning, right on the front steps of my son's multi-million-dollar Pennsylvania estate. It was a lesson about the people we let into our homes, the ones who smile at us across the dinner table while holding a knife behind their backs. If you're listening to this, I need you to understand something. Betrayal doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it looks like a stainless steel lunchbox. If you've ever had a gut feeling that something wasn't right, that someone you loved was in danger, pay attention. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from today. Let's talk about the truth. It was a crisp, clear morning. I had driven over to Bradley's place just to drop off a file folder. It contained some old property deeds he needed for his architectural firm. Bradley is 35. He's my only son. I handed him the reins to the company 2 years ago, wanting him to take the legacy and make it his own. He married Monica 3 years ago. I'll admit I never quite warmed up to her. There was always a sharp edge beneath her polished exterior, a kind of cold calculation in her eyes. But Bradley loved her, and as a father you try to accept the person your child chooses. You try to believe the best. I stood on the expansive front porch, the morning sun glinting off the massive oak double doors. I raised my hand to knock, but before my knuckles even touched the wood, the door flew open. Monica burst out. She was frantic, her blonde hair slightly disheveled, a stark contrast to her usually immaculate appearance. She had a phone wedged between her ear and her shoulder, and she was arguing with someone in hushed, urgent tones. I said I need it delivered immediately. She hissed into the phone. No delays. Do you understand? She didn't even look at me. In her right hand she clutched a heavy stainless steel thermal lunchbox, the kind you'd use to keep soup hot for a 12-hour shift. Without missing a beat in her angry phone call, she shoved the heavy container forcefully against my chest. Here, take it. And do not drop it. She snapped clearly, mistaking me for some kind of courier or assistant Bradley might have sent. I stumbled back a step, catching the lunchbox reflexively. Monica, I said, my voice confused. She froze. The phone slipped from her shoulder, clattering onto the expensive stone porch. Her eyes snapped up to meet mine. I have seen fear in my life. I've seen the panic of a foreman when a beam slips. But the look on Monica's face was something entirely different. All the blood drained from her face in an instant, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll. Her eyes went wide with a raw, unadulterated terror. William? She gasped, her voice trembling. What? What are you doing here? I brought Bradley's files, I said, holding up the manila folder. I looked down at the thermal lunchbox in my hands. It was surprisingly heavy. What is this Bradley's lunch? For a split second, she couldn't speak. She was paralyzed. Then a frantic, almost violent energy overtook her. She lunged forward, her manicured hands grasping desperately for the handle of the lunchbox. Give it to me! She demanded, her voice shrill, completely devoid of her usual refined tone. That's not for you. It's a mistake. Give it back. Her sudden aggression triggered an instinct I hadn't felt in years. The instinct of a man who knows when a situation is volatile. I didn't think. I just reacted. I yanked the lunchbox out of her reach and spun around. William, she shrieked, scrambling after me. It's just dietary supplements, Bradley's smoothies. He needs them. Give them to me right now. I didn't answer. I reached my car, wrenched the passenger door open, and tossed the lunchbox onto the leather seat. I slammed the door shut and hit the remote lock on my key fob just as Monica slammed her hands against the window. William, open this door! She screamed, her face contorted with a mixture of rage and panic pounding on the glass. You have no right! Open the door! I ignored her. I walked around to the driver's side, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. I got in, started the engine, and threw the car into reverse. I backed out of the long, winding driveway, watching her in the rearview mirror. She was standing on the steps, her hands pulling at her hair, screaming something I couldn't hear over the engine. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. What the hell had just happened? Why was she so desperate to get a simple lunchbox back? Dietary supplements, smoothies. People don't react with that level of terror over a protein shake. The heavy stainless steel container sat on the passenger seat, almost mocking me. It felt like a ticking bomb. I needed to clear my head. I drove away from the upscale neighborhood, the grand houses blurring past me. I headed toward a small, quiet diner across town, a place I often went when I needed to think. My hands were still shaking slightly as I pulled into the parking lot. I grabbed the lunchbox. I needed to see what was inside. I needed to know why my daughter-in-law had looked at me as if I had just uncovered her darkest secret. I walked into the diner, the bell above the door chiming lightly. I saw Patricia sitting in our usual booth near the back. Patricia and I have known each other for over 20 years. She's a retired head nurse, 40 years in the trauma ward at City General. She's seen it all, the best and the worst of humanity, and she possesses a calm, analytical mind that I desperately needed right now. "William," she smiled as I slid into the booth opposite her. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I might have," I muttered, placing the heavy thermal lunchbox on the table between us. Patricia raised an eyebrow. "Packing your own lunch these days, or did Lena finally convince you to try those kale smoothies?" She joked, mentioning my late wife. "It's not mine," I said, my voice tight. "It's from Bradley's house. Monica gave it to me by accident. She thought I was a courier." "Okay," Patricia said, slowly picking up on my tension. And when she realized it was me, she panicked. She physically tried to rip it out of my hands. She told me it was just dietary supplements, but she was terrified, Patricia. Absolutely terrified. Patricia's expression shifted from amused to concerned. She reached into her purse. "Well, let's see what's got her so worked up. Actually, do you mind? I need to put my insulin somewhere cool. The AC in my car is acting up again." "Go ahead," I said. Patricia unscrewed the thick, insulated lid of the lunchbox. She peered inside. "There's no food in here," she noted, her brow furrowing. "Just liquid." I leaned over. Inside the deep container were two large, tightly sealed glass bottles filled with an opaque, milky white liquid. She said they were his smoothies. I offered, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. Patricia reached in and carefully lifted one of the bottles. She examined the liquid, turning the bottle slowly. "This doesn't look like any smoothie I've ever seen. It's too uniform. Too chemical." She placed the bottle back inside and then noticed something else. "William," she said, her voice dropping a register, "there's a false bottom in this thing." She reached down, her experienced fingers probing the edges of the lunchbox's interior. With a soft click, a plastic panel lifted away. Beneath the bottles of opaque liquid lay a small, meticulously organized compartment. Inside were 6 tiny amber glass vials. None of them had labels. Tucked neatly beside them was a precision medical dropper, the kind used for measuring exact microscopic doses. The air in the diner suddenly felt very cold. I stared at the hidden compartment, a heavy dread settling in my stomach. Dietary supplements didn't require hidden compartments and precision droppers. Patricia didn't say a word. Her face was set in lines of intense concentration. She reached into the compartment and carefully extracted one of the amber vials. She unscrewed the tiny black cap. She brought the vial close to her nose, sniffing cautiously. I watched her face closely. I expected confusion, maybe curiosity. Instead, I saw Patricia, a woman who had spent 40 years dealing with blood trauma and death without flinching, turn completely pale. All the color drained from her cheeks. Her eyes widened, focusing on the small vial in her hand. She didn't just sniff it. She carefully tipped the vial, letting a microscopic drop fall onto the very tip of her index finger. She rubbed it against her thumb, feeling the consistency, then brought it to her nose again. Her relaxed demeanor vanished instantly. She capped the vial with swift, sharp movements and placed it back in the hidden compartment. She snapped the false bottom shut and slammed the lid of the lunchbox down. She looked at me, her eyes boring into mine. The panic I had seen in Monica's eyes was now reflected in Patricia's, but mixed with a horrifying certainty. "William," Patricia said, grabbing my forearm with a grip that bruised. Her voice was an urgent, terrified whisper. "Get Bradley to a hospital right now." "What, why?" I asked, my voice rising. "What is it? I can't explain everything right now. I need a lab to confirm it," she said, her words rushing out. "But William, listen to me carefully. If you don't get him help, your son could die before the weekend. My daughter-in-law accidentally gave me my son's lunchbox." A retired nurse took one look at it and turned pale. "Get your son to a hospital right now." "Why?" I asked. "I can't explain, but if you don't, he could die." What I discovered at the hospital left me stunned. I stood on the expansive front porch of my son's multi-million-dollar Pennsylvania estate on a crisp Tuesday morning. I am 70 years old, a retired construction CEO who spent 40 grueling years turning dirt into a highly profitable empire. I built skyscrapers, commercial hospitals, and the concrete foundation this city proudly stands on today. 2 years ago, I proudly handed the reins of my company over to my 35-year-old son, Bradley. He married Monica 3 years ago. I never quite warmed up to her. There was always a sharp edge beneath her polished exterior, a cold calculation hidden deep in her eyes. But Bradley loved her, and as a father, you try to unconditionally accept the person your child chooses. I held a thick manila file folder containing old property deeds Bradley urgently needed. I raised my hand to knock, but before my knuckles touched the wood, the heavy door violently flew open. Monica burst out onto the porch. She was entirely frantic, her blonde hair disheveled, a stark contrast to her usually immaculate appearance. She had a cell phone wedged tightly between her ear and shoulder, arguing with someone in incredibly urgent tones. "I said I need it delivered immediately," she hissed viciously into the phone. "No delays. Do you understand me?" She did not even look at me. In her right hand, she clutched a heavy stainless steel thermal lunchbox. Without missing a single beat in her angry phone call, she shoved the metal container forcefully against my chest. "Here, take it. And do not drop it," she snapped aggressively, clearly mistaking me for a hired courier Bradley might have sent. I stumbled back a step, catching the cold metal lunchbox reflexively. "Monica!" I said, my voice thick with absolute confusion. She froze completely still. The phone slipped from her shoulder, clattering loudly onto the stone porch. Her eyes snapped up to directly meet mine. I have seen the raw panic of a foreman when a massive steel beam slips from a crane. But the look on Monica's face in that exact moment was something entirely different. All the color drained from her face in an instant. Her eyes went incredibly wide with a raw, unadulterated terror I had never witnessed before. "William," she gasped, her voice trembling violently. "What are you doing here?" "I brought Bradley's files," I said. I looked down at the heavy thermal lunchbox in my hands. "What is this, Bradley's lunch?" For a split second, she could not speak. Then a frantic, almost violent energy suddenly overtook her. She lunged forward, her hands grasping desperately for the handle of the lunchbox. "Give it to me," she demanded, her voice shrill. "That is not for you. It is a mistake. Give it back right now." Her sudden, unhinged aggression triggered a deep instinct. I yanked the lunchbox completely out of her reach and spun around quickly. "William," she shrieked, scrambling frantically after me down the porch steps. "It is just dietary supplements. Bradley's smoothies. He needs them. Give them to me right now." I did not answer her. I reached my car, wrenched the passenger door open, and tossed the lunchbox onto the leather seat. I slammed the door shut and hit the remote lock on my key fob, just as Monica slammed her hands against the tinted window. "William, open this door!" she screamed, her face contorted with a terrifying mixture of rage and panic, pounding her fists on the glass. You have absolutely no right. Open the door. I ignored her completely. I walked around to the driver's side, got in, started the engine, and threw the car into reverse. I backed out of the long driveway, watching her intensely in the rearview mirror. She was standing on the steps, screaming something I could not hear. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles were stark white. What the hell had just happened? Why was she so desperate to get a simple lunchbox back? Dietary supplements, smoothies. People do not react with that level of sheer terror over a protein shake. I drove away from the upscale neighborhood. I headed toward a quiet diner across town, a place I often went to think. My hands were still shaking slightly as I pulled into the parking lot. I grabbed the lunchbox. I needed to see what was inside. I walked into the diner, the bell above the door chiming lightly. I saw Patricia sitting in our usual booth near the back. Patricia and I have known each other for over 20 years. She is a retired head nurse, 40 years in the trauma ward at City General. She possesses a calm, analytical mind that I desperately needed right now. William. She smiled as I slid into the booth opposite her. You look like you have seen a ghost. I think I might have, I muttered, placing the heavy thermal lunchbox on the table between us. Patricia raised an eyebrow. Packing your own lunch these days, or did you finally try those kale smoothies? It is not mine, I said, my voice tight. It is from Bradley's house. Monica gave it to me by accident. She thought I was a courier. And when she realized it was me, she panicked. She physically tried to rip it out of my hands. She told me it was just dietary supplements, but she was absolutely terrified. Patricia's expression shifted to highly concerned. She reached into her purse. Well, let us see what has her so worked up. Actually, do you mind? I need to put my insulin somewhere cool. The air conditioning in my car is broken. Go ahead, I said. Patricia unscrewed the thick lid of the lunchbox. She peered inside. There is no food in here, she noted, her brow furrowing. Just liquid. I leaned over. Inside the deep container were 2 large, tightly sealed glass bottles filled with an opaque, milky white liquid. She said they were his smoothies, I offered. Patricia reached in and carefully lifted one of the bottles. She examined the liquid. This does not look like any smoothie I have ever seen. It is too uniform, too chemical. She placed the bottle back inside and noticed something else. William, she said, her voice dropping. There is a false bottom in this thing. She reached down her experienced fingers, probing the edges of the interior. With a soft click, a plastic panel lifted away. Beneath the bottles lay a small compartment. Inside were 6 tiny amber glass vials. None of them had labels. Tucked neatly beside them was a precision medical dropper, the kind used for measuring exact microscopic doses. The air in the diner suddenly felt very cold. I stared at the hidden compartment, a heavy dread settling in my stomach. Dietary supplements did not require hidden compartments and precision droppers. Patricia did not say a word. Her face was set in lines of intense concentration. She reached into the compartment and carefully extracted one of the amber vials. She unscrewed the tiny black cap. She brought the vial close to her nose, sniffing cautiously. I expected confusion. Instead, I saw Patricia, a woman who spent 40 years dealing with trauma and death without flinching, turn completely pale. All the color drained from her cheeks. Her eyes widened, focusing on the small vial in her hand. She did not just sniff it. She carefully tipped the vial, letting a microscopic drop fall onto the very tip of her index finger. She rubbed it against her thumb, feeling the consistency, then brought it to her nose again. Her relaxed demeanor vanished instantly. She capped the vial with swift, sharp movements and placed it back in the hidden compartment. She snapped the false bottom shut and slammed the lid of the lunchbox down. She looked at me, her eyes boring into mine. The panic I had seen in Monica's eyes was now reflected in Patricia's, but mixed with a horrifying certainty. William, Patricia said, grabbing my forearm with a grip that bruised. Her voice was an urgent, terrified whisper. Get your son to a hospital right now. What? Why? I asked, my voice rising. What is it I cannot explain right now? I need a lab to confirm it, she said, her words rushing out. But William, listen to me carefully. If you do not get him help, your son could die before the weekend. Trust is a foundational pillar of family. But blind trust is a luxury no man who has built an empire can afford. The truth is often hiding in plain sight, masked by sweet words and plausible excuses. This ordeal taught me that true love for your child sometimes means suspecting those closest to them. When your gut tells you something is wrong, do not ignore it to keep the peace. Investigate, verify, and prepare for the worst. Betrayal rarely comes from enemies. It comes from those holding the keys to your home. Protect your blood and your legacy always. Did this story make your blood boil? If you have ever dealt with toxic in-laws or had to fight to protect your family, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Leave a comment below letting me know where you are watching from today and what you would have done. The silence in the diner stretched into an unbearable eternity. Patricia's fingers dug into my forearm with a desperate strength I did not know she possessed. I stared at her, trying to process the absolute gravity of her terrifying words. Die before the weekend. The phrase echoed in my mind, a horrifying loop that completely shattered my reality. This was not a dramatic exaggeration. Patricia was a woman of science, a veteran of the trauma ward who dealt in cold, hard facts. If she was terrified, I needed to be terrified. I did not ask another single question. I looked down at the false bottom of the thermal lunchbox, at the tiny amber vials sitting like toxic little secrets, and I felt a sudden surge of pure primal adrenaline. I snapped the lid back onto the heavy container and secured the thick metal latches. I grabbed my car keys from the table, completely ignoring my untouched mug of black coffee. Keep that safe, I told her, my voice turning into a low, rough growl. I will call you as soon as I know he is totally secure. Patricia nodded, her face still an ashen mask of extreme worry. Hurry, William, she whispered urgently. Do not wait for a useless ambulance. Just get him to the emergency room yourself right away. I turned and walked rapidly toward the diner exit. My 40 years of running massive construction sites had trained me to remain calm under extreme pressure, to handle structural failures and sudden catastrophes with a level head. But this was not concrete and steel. This was my own flesh and blood. This was my only child. I pushed through the glass door and stepped out into the crisp morning air, breaking into a heavy, determined sprint toward my vehicle. I threw the lunchbox onto the passenger seat once again, but this time it felt like a crucial piece of physical evidence in a sinister crime I was just beginning to uncover. I fired up the loud engine, my rough hands gripping the steering wheel with intense white-knuckled pressure. The tires squealed aggressively against the dark asphalt as I pulled out of the parking lot and merged directly into the heavy city traffic. My mind was racing 1,000 miles an hour, piecing together random fragments of the past few weeks that I had previously brushed off as normal stress. Bradley had been looking terribly tired lately. He had lost a lot of weight. Whenever we spoke on the phone, his responses seemed slightly delayed, his usually sharp wit dulled by a strange creeping lethargy. Monica had always blamed it heavily on the extreme demands of running the architectural firm. She claimed he was working too many late nights, managing too many complex structural projects, and simply refusing to rest properly. She played the flawless role of the highly concerned, attentive wife so perfectly that I had never questioned her false narrative. I had easily accepted her plausible lie because it was significantly easier than facing the horrifying dark alternative that now sat quietly on my passenger seat. The stressful drive to the commercial district was a terrifying blur. I wove aggressively through tight lanes, completely ignoring speed limits and angry honking horns. Every single red light felt like a direct personal attack. Every slow-moving delivery vehicle, a massive obstacle threatening my son's life. The skyline of the city, featuring several towering glass structures my own company had proudly built, rose steadily before me. Bradley's architectural firm occupied the top 2 floors of a highly modern, high-security commercial building right in the beating heart of downtown. I pulled up violently to the front entrance, completely ignoring the prominent painted signs that strictly prohibited civilian parking. I left the running car in the loading zone, violently killed the engine, and forcefully grabbed the heavy thermal lunchbox. I stormed through the revolving glass doors with a singular, ferocious, unstoppable purpose. The main lobby was a cavernous space of highly polished marble, expensive modern art, and soft, relaxing ambient lighting. A young, bewildered security guard in a crisp, dark blue uniform stood defensively behind a massive wooden reception desk. He looked up rapidly as I approached, opening his mouth to politely ask for my visitor identification. I did not give him the chance. "I am William Harrison." I barked, my voice booming across the quiet lobby with the raw authority of a man who owned the very foundation under his feet. "I am going upstairs to see my son right now." Before the startled guard could formulate a response, I bypassed the security turnstiles, pushing through the executive gate with aggressive, undeniable force. I stepped into the elevator and slammed my palm against the button for the 20th floor. The ascent felt agonizingly slow. The smooth, mechanical hum of the modern elevator provided a highly jarring contrast to the frantic, chaotic pounding of my own heart. I watched the glowing digital floor numbers tick upward, sequentially, praying silently to whatever listening higher power existed that I was not dangerously too late. When the metal doors finally slid open with a soft, welcoming chime, I stepped out rapidly into the sleek, minimalist reception area of Bradley's prestigious firm. The young receptionist, a well-dressed woman, who clearly knew me from several previous friendly visits, offered a highly polite, welcoming smile. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she said quite cheerfully. "Bradley is currently working inside his private office. Would you like me to formally announce you?" I did not offer a single word in response. I walked straight past her curved, polished wooden desk, my heavy leather boots thudding loudly and aggressively against the pristine hardwood floor. "Mr. Harrison," she called out nervously, a sharp note of genuine alarm quickly entering her pleasant voice. I marched purposefully down the central hallway, easily passing several glass-walled conference rooms, where busy architects and creative designers looked up rapidly from their large drafting tables, clearly startled by my rapid, intensely purposeful stride. I absolutely did not care about maintaining professional decorum today. I did not care about creating a loud public scene. I only cared about reaching the large frosted glass door positioned at the very end of the long corridor. The shiny brass nameplate securely fastened there proudly read, "Bradley Harrison, Principal Architect." I did not even bother to knock respectfully. I raised my right leg and delivered a solid, highly forceful kick directly next to the metal door handle. The heavy glass door flew open instantly with a violent, shattering crash, slamming incredibly hard against the interior white wall and bouncing back slightly toward me. I rushed directly into the spacious, brightly sunlit office, the heavy metal lunchbox still clutched incredibly tightly in my trembling hand. "Bradley!" I shouted, my voice desperate, deep, and heavily commanding. What I saw instantly stopped me absolutely dead in my tracks. My son was sitting in his large leather executive chair, but he was certainly not working. He was heavily slumped forward, his upper body completely draped over the smooth edge of his massive oak desk. His arms hung lifelessly by his sides, his expensive, tailored suit jacket terribly wrinkled and completely disheveled. I dropped the lunchbox onto the soft carpeted floor and rushed directly to his side, grabbing him forcefully by the shoulders and pulling him back against the tall chair. His heavy head rolled backward lazily, his chin pointing weakly toward the ceiling tiles above us. "Bradley, look at me right now," I demanded gently, slapping his pale cheek repeatedly to desperately rouse him from his stupor. His eyelids fluttered open slowly, but they were definitely not the sharp, intelligent eyes of the brilliant architect who had designed award-winning commercial structures. They were heavily bloodshot, deeply glassy, and terribly vacant, staring right through me as if I were nothing but a transparent ghost. His skin was deathly pale, heavily covered in a thick layer of cold, clammy sweat, that made his forehead shine unhealthily under the bright fluorescent office lights. "Dad," he mumbled weakly. His voice was incredibly thick and heavily slurred, the simple words dragging together like heavy wet stones. "I feel so terribly tired today. My brain hurts so badly." A thick line of drool escaped the left corner of his pale mouth, dripping slowly onto his expensive silk tie. "I just need to sleep for a while." He tried to blink slowly, but his heavy eyelids immediately fluttered shut again, his chin dropping back down toward his chest, as he lost the incredibly brief, agonizing battle for basic human consciousness right in front of my completely terrified eyes, leaving me standing there, holding my breath, in total, unadulterated fear, completely paralyzed by the horrific dark reality of what Monica had actually done to my beloved son. I hauled Bradley out of his heavy leather executive chair. His body was completely limp, essentially dead weight against my shoulder. I am a 70-year-old man, but the sheer adrenaline coursing through my veins gave me the physical strength of someone half my age. I wrapped his right arm securely around my neck and gripped his waist firmly, pulling him toward the shattered glass door of his office. The brilliant architect who had designed incredibly complex structures was now stumbling blindly, his feet dragging awkwardly against the plush carpet. We moved out into the main corridor. The young receptionist I had passed earlier let out a sharp gasp, springing up from her desk, her hands flying to her mouth in total shock. Several other designers and junior architects rushed out of their conference rooms, their faces painted with extreme alarm as they watched their boss being practically carried down the hallway by his father. One young man stepped forward, frantically offering to call an ambulance. I barked at him to stand completely aside. Waiting for paramedics would waste precious, irreplaceable minutes. I told the terrified staff to open the main lobby doors and clear a direct path to the loading zone. They scrambled to obey my command, rushing ahead to hold the heavy doors wide open. We made it into the elevator. Bradley leaned heavily against the stainless steel wall, his head rolling to the side. He muttered something entirely incomprehensible, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. I held him upright, silently urging the elevator to descend faster. The moment the doors parted on the ground floor, I dragged him through the lobby, completely ignoring the confused stares of the security personnel and the visiting clients. We finally reached my vehicle. I shoved the heavy thermal lunchbox deeper into the passenger side footwell and carefully maneuvered Bradley into the front seat, securing his seatbelt tightly across his chest. I slammed the door, rushed to the driver's side, and tore out of the loading zone with a violent screech of heavy tires. The hospital was exactly 12 blocks away. I drove like a man possessed by a singular, desperate mission. I swerved aggressively through the thick midday traffic, laying on my horn continuously to force other vehicles out of my path. I completely bypassed several red lights, narrowly avoiding two serious collisions, my eyes darting frantically between the congested road ahead and my son slumped helplessly beside me. His breathing was becoming increasingly shallow. His pale skin was now taking on a horrifying, sickeningly gray pallor. The terrifying words Patricia had spoken in the diner rang loudly in my ears, warning me that he could die before the weekend. I was not going to let that happen. I had spent my entire life building protective shelters for other people, and I was going to protect my own flesh and blood. I saw the bright red emergency room signs approaching rapidly. I bypassed the main parking structure entirely and drove my vehicle straight up onto the concrete ramp designated strictly for incoming ambulances. I slammed the transmission into park, leaving the engine running and the driver's side door wide open. I sprinted around the front of the car, yanked Bradley out of the passenger seat, and shouted at the top of my lungs. I demanded immediate medical assistance. Two orderlies standing near the sliding glass doors took one look at Bradley and immediately sprang into action. They rushed forward with a sturdy medical gurney, their faces set in grim professional concentration. I helped them lower my son onto the pristine white sheets. A seasoned triage nurse flanked the gurney, shining a bright penlight directly into Bradley's unresponsive, dilated pupils. She rapidly fired off a series of standard medical questions, asking about his medical history, known allergies, and exactly what substances he might have ingested. I reached deep into the passenger footwell of my car and pulled out the heavy thermal lunchbox. I popped the metal latches, ripped away the false bottom, and grabbed the small, unlabeled amber vials. I shoved them directly into the hands of the attending emergency room physician who had just rushed out to join the chaotic scene. I grabbed the collar of his white coat, locking my eyes intensely with his. I demanded that they run a comprehensive full-spectrum toxicology screen immediately. I explicitly told him that someone was actively poisoning my son, and those unmarked vials held the weapon. The doctor nodded sharply, acknowledging the severe gravity of the situation, and handed the vials to a nearby nurse with strict orders for the laboratory. They rushed Bradley through a set of heavy double doors, shouting medical codes and vital signs, leaving me standing completely alone on the harsh concrete ramp. A security guard politely asked me to move my vehicle. I numbly handed him the keys and walked slowly into the brightly lit, deeply sterile emergency waiting room. The sharp, unmistakable scent of harsh antiseptic and industrial floor cleaner assaulted my senses. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting long, cold shadows across the rows of uncomfortable plastic chairs. I found an empty seat in the far corner and collapsed heavily into it. The massive surge of protective adrenaline that had fueled my frantic rescue mission abruptly vanished, leaving me feeling entirely hollow and physically exhausted. My hands were trembling violently. I clasped them tightly together, resting my elbows on my knees, staring blankly at the gray linoleum floor. The silence in the waiting area was deafening, occasionally punctuated by the distant, muffled sound of a crying child or a medical pager beeping urgently. Sitting there in that cold room, my mind inevitably drifted backward. I closed my eyes and vividly remembered the agonizingly difficult early days of my career. I saw myself 40 years ago, a young, exhausted laborer, covered head to toe in thick dirt and wet concrete. I remembered the heavy steel beams I hoisted with my bare, bleeding hands to build my first commercial project. I literally broke my back and sacrificed my youth to build a massive construction empire from absolute scratch. I did all that grueling work for one specific reason. I built an unshakable fortress of wealth, so my only son would never experience true hardship. I gave him the world on a silver platter. Yet despite my immense wealth, my son was currently fighting for his life in a sterile hospital bed just 50 feet away from me. All the money in my corporate bank accounts could not protect him from the sinister, invisible threat that infiltrated his home. That fleeting sense of failure was quickly replaced by a totally different emotion. A cold, dark, and utterly consuming rage began to simmer deep within my chest. I sat up straight in the hard plastic chair, my trembling hands finally steadying. I wiped a single tear of frustration from my cheek, replacing my fear with absolute, unwavering resolve. I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I would systematically destroy whoever was responsible for this betrayal. I would completely and utterly tear down their perfect, deceptive world piece by piece and brick by solid brick. The heavy automatic doors of the emergency department suddenly slid apart, with a loud mechanical hum shattering the tense silence of the waiting area. Monica burst through the entrance, her designer heels clicking frantically against the polished linoleum floor. Her performance was absolutely flawless. She had somehow managed to make herself look completely disheveled, her blonde hair falling in messy strands around her face, her eyes red and brimming with fresh tears. She sprinted toward the main reception desk, her hands trembling as she grabbed the high counter, sobbing uncontrollably. She begged the nurses to tell her where her husband was, her voice cracking with a perfectly calibrated tone of absolute despair. She played the role of the terrified, devoted wife with such terrifying conviction that even the hardened triage nurses softened, rushing out to comfort her. When she finally spotted me sitting in the corner, she let out a dramatic, breathless gasp. She ran toward me, her arms outstretched, throwing herself against my chest in a desperate embrace. I stood there stiff as a board, my hands firmly at my sides, feeling the cold, calculated intent radiating beneath her theatrical sobbing. "William," she wailed, burying her face into my shoulder. "What happened to him? Is he going to be all right? Please tell me he is going to be okay." I did not wrap my arms around her. I simply looked down at her, seeing right through the masterful illusion she was actively painting. Before I could even formulate a response, the attending physician, who had taken the vials from me earlier, emerged from the secure treatment area. He looked tired, holding a metal clipboard and a small plastic bag containing the amber glass bottles. Monica instantly detached herself from me, rushing toward the doctor with her hands clasped together in desperate prayer. "Doctor, please, I am his wife," she pleaded, her voice trembling beautifully. "Please tell me what is wrong with Bradley." The doctor offered her a sympathetic, reassuring smile, gently guiding her toward a quiet corner of the busy emergency room. I followed closely behind them, my jaw clenched tightly, determined not to let her control the narrative. The doctor explained that Bradley was currently stable, resting comfortably in a private bay and receiving intravenous fluids. He then held up the clear plastic bag containing the unmarked vials I had confiscated from the hidden compartment of the thermal lunchbox. "We are running a standard toxicology screen right now," the doctor stated, his tone shifting to a more serious, probing register. "Your father-in-law brought these in." He indicated that Bradley might have ingested something from them. "Can you tell me exactly what these contain?" Monica did not flinch. She did not hesitate or stumble over her words. Her transition from a hysterical, weeping spouse to a highly organized, completely rational caretaker was breathtakingly smooth. She let out a long, exhausted sigh, wiping a stray tear from her cheek, projecting the image of a woman simply overwhelmed by a chaotic misunderstanding. "Oh goodness," she said, her voice dripping with profound relief. "I was so incredibly terrified that he had suffered a heart attack." "Doctor, those vials are absolutely nothing dangerous. They are his prescribed dietary supplements." She quickly reached into her expensive leather handbag and seamlessly produced a crisp, heavily embossed prescription pad, unfolding a detailed medical document with practiced ease. She handed the crisp paper directly to the attending physician. "Bradley has been suffering from severe, debilitating executive burnout for the past 6 months." Monica explained, her tone deeply earnest and highly professional. "The stress of running his architectural firm has completely ruined his sleep cycle and his nutritional intake. We finally went to a specialized holistic wellness clinic downtown. Those vials contain highly concentrated, customized doses of vitamin B12, magnesium, and a blend of imported cognitive enhancers. They are specialized nootropics designed to help him regain his energy and focus. The clinic compounds them specifically for his unique metabolic needs. That is why they do not have standard commercial pharmacy labels on the glass." I stared at her, my blood running completely cold. The lie was entirely airtight, supported by official-looking paperwork from an expensive, exclusive wellness center. She had clearly anticipated this exact scenario. She had built a robust, perfectly documented alibi for whatever dark chemical cocktail she was slowly pumping into my son's veins. The doctor took the folded paper from her hands, adjusting his glasses to carefully review the elegant letterhead and the complex list of natural ingredients and vitamin complexes printed on the page. He read through the clinical jargon, his posture visibly relaxing with every passing second. The deep lines of concern on his forehead smoothed out entirely, convinced by the official documentation and Monica's remarkably steady, confident explanation. I stepped forward, unable to contain the burning frustration building rapidly inside my chest. "Doctor, that is a complete fabrication," I stated firmly, pointing a shaking finger directly at her. "My friend is a retired head nurse with 40 years of trauma experience." She examined that liquid. "She told me it was incredibly dangerous." Monica hid those vials in a secret compartment inside a heavy thermal container. "People do not hide basic vitamins in false bottoms." The doctor looked up from the paperwork, his gaze shifting back and forth between my angry, flushed face and Monica's picture-perfect expression of long-suffering patience. Well, sir, the doctor began, his tone now adopting that gentle, slightly patronizing cadence medical professionals use when dealing with highly agitated family members. We have just received the initial results from the rapid toxicology panel. The standard drug screen came back completely clean. There are absolutely no narcotics, no heavy metals, and no common acute poisons present in his bloodstream at this time. He handed the prescription document back to Monica, offering her another sympathetic nod. Based on his current physical presentation and his blood work, Bradley is suffering from profound clinical dehydration, severe physical exhaustion, and acute psychological stress. His electrolyte levels are dangerously low, which perfectly explains the lethargy, the confusion, and the slurred speech you witnessed at his office. The vitamin regimen his wife described is actually quite common for high-level executives dealing with extreme burnout. But the hidden compartment, I insisted, desperately feeling the solid ground shifting treacherously beneath my feet. You have to send those specific vials out for a deep chemical analysis. A standard drug screen will not catch a custom synthetic compound. I appreciate your deep concern, sir, the doctor replied, his voice growing noticeably firmer, clearly signaling that the medical investigation was officially concluded. But we treat the patient based on clinical evidence, not suspicions. Your son simply needs rest fluids and a significantly reduced workload. We will keep him here for observation for a few more hours, but he is fundamentally safe. When the doctor left, Monica's entire demeanor instantly shifted. Her tragic weeping posture completely vanished. She squared her shoulders, the artificial warmth rapidly draining from her beautiful face. Her eyes went absolutely dead, staring at me with cold, calculating stillness. William, you are quickly becoming dangerously paranoid. You suffocate him now. I stared at Monica, letting her sharp, deeply insulting words echo in the sterile hospital corridor. She stood there with her arms crossed, projecting an aura of absolute control. My initial instinct was to shout, to tear down her perfect facade right then and there. I wanted to drag the doctor back and force him to look closer. But 40 years of negotiating brutal corporate contracts and navigating treacherous construction deals had taught me a highly valuable lesson. You never show your hand to an enemy who holds the high ground. Right now, Monica had the doctor, the documentation, and the narrative completely on her side. If I pushed harder, I would only solidify her claim that I was a paranoid, declining old man, so I did the hardest thing I have ever had to do in my entire life. I swallowed my pride. I let my shoulders slump forward, forcing my posture to reflect the image of a tired, thoroughly defeated senior citizen. I looked down at the linoleum floor and let out a long, heavy sigh. You are right, Monica, I whispered, making sure my voice carried a subtle tremor of age and exhaustion. I am just so terribly worried about him. His mother passed away so suddenly, and seeing him collapsed over his desk just brought all that fear rushing back. I am overreacting. I am sorry for causing such a scene. The transformation in her demeanor was instantaneous and deeply chilling. The coldness in her eyes morphed into a sickeningly sweet, patronizing warmth. She reached out and patted my arm gently, a gesture meant to belittle rather than comfort. It is perfectly fine, William, she said softly. We all know you mean well. You just need to step back and let me take care of my husband. Go home and rest. I will handle everything from here. I nodded meekly, turning my back on her and walking slowly toward the hospital exit. I shuffled my feet slightly, playing the part flawlessly. But the moment the automatic doors slid shut behind me and the cool evening air hit my face, the defeated old man completely vanished. The 70-year-old shark was fully awake. I drove back to my quiet condominium with a singular, laser-focused objective. I could no longer rely on medical professionals or external authorities to simply believe my unverified suspicions. Monica had insulated herself with expensive holistic prescriptions and plausible medical excuses. I needed to gather indisputable intelligence. I needed to watch her every single move without her ever realizing she was being observed. Over the next 2 weeks, I initiated a carefully calculated campaign of unannounced visits to their grand Lincoln Park estate. I never called ahead. I always arrived with a perfectly mundane, harmless excuse ready on my lips. Sometimes I brought a misdelivered piece of mail. Other times I brought fresh vegetables from the local farmer's market, claiming I had bought entirely too much for just one person. On my very first unannounced visit, it was a Thursday afternoon. I rang the heavy brass doorbell and waited. Monica opened the door, her smile instantly tightening into a thin, irritated line before she remembered to play the gracious daughter-in-law. "William," she said, blocking the doorway slightly with her body. "What a surprise. We were not expecting you today." I held up a small paper bag of fresh peaches. "I was just passing through the neighborhood and thought Bradley might enjoy these," I said cheerfully, pushing my way gently but firmly past her into the grand foyer. "How is my boy doing today?" Monica hurriedly followed me, her footsteps sharp on the hardwood floor. "He is resting, William. The doctor said he needs absolute quiet to recover from his burnout." I ignored her subtle command to leave and walked directly into the expansive living room. Bradley was sitting in a deep leather armchair by the large bay window. The sight of him sent a cold, sharp spike of absolute terror directly into my heart. He was wearing loose sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt entirely uncharacteristic for a man who previously tailored his casual wear. "Bradley," I called out softly, approaching his chair. He slowly turned his head toward me. The movement was incredibly sluggish, as if he were moving underwater. His face was gaunt, his cheekbones jutting out sharply beneath his pale skin. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened into bruised purple shadows. "Hey, Dad," he murmured. His voice was a flat, emotionless monotone. He did not attempt to stand up or offer a handshake. He just stared at me with completely vacant, deeply unfocused eyes. I pulled up a small footstool and sat directly across from him, leaning in closely. "How are you feeling, son? Are you getting any of your strength back?" He blinked slowly, his brow furrowing as if trying to process a highly complex mathematical equation. "I am just so tired." He slurred the words, dragging heavily against each other. "My head feels like it is completely stuffed with thick cotton. I cannot seem to concentrate on a single thought." I glanced over my shoulder. Monica was standing in the arched doorway of the kitchen, watching our interaction with intense, hawkish vigilance. She held a glass of water, her knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. "It is the recovery process, William," she interjected smoothly, stepping into the room to establish her physical dominance over the space. "The clinic warned us that his body would need to heavily detoxify from all the severe corporate stress. He just needs time and his proper nutritional support." She placed a possessive hand on Bradley's shoulder, her fingers digging slightly into his fabric. He leaned his head against her hand entirely, compliant, completely stripped of his usual independent spirit. It was absolutely sickening to witness. This brilliant, driven architect was being systematically reduced to a docile, compliant shell of a human being right in front of me. I smiled warmly at her, masking my burning rage. "Well, you are certainly taking excellent care of him, Monica. I will not stay long and disturb his rest." Before I decided to leave the grim living room, I slowly pulled my smartphone out from my jacket pocket, making a deliberate show of checking my new messages. "Bradley, I tried calling your personal cell yesterday, but it went straight to voicemail. I wanted to run a small property question by you." Bradley stared blankly, patting his empty pockets with slow, clumsy hands. "I do not know where it is," he mumbled weakly. Monica stepped smoothly between us, her smile perfectly rigid. "We instituted a strict digital detox," she declared firmly. "The doctors insisted that blue light and constant work emails were severely hindering his neurological recovery. I have completely secured his devices until he is medically cleared. He needs total isolation to truly heal." I nodded, slipping my phone away. "Of course, that is incredibly smart." I agreed politely. I said my quiet goodbyes and walked out to my car. I gripped the steering wheel, my jaw clenched. My only son was a prisoner trapped in his own house right now. The chilling realization washed over me like a bucket of ice water. I sat in my idling car for nearly an hour, staring at the imposing iron gates of the estate my own money had helped secure. I knew I could not simply storm back inside and loudly accuse her without absolute, undeniable proof. The emergency room doctor had already dismissed my valid concerns, formally documenting me as a highly anxious, overbearing parent. If I called the police right now, Monica would smoothly produce her fraudulent holistic paperwork, and the authorities would politely escort me off the premises for trespassing. She had brilliantly positioned herself as the exhausted, devoted caregiver, effectively turning my own son into a heavily medicated hostage in plain sight. I needed to see exactly how she was administering this poison. I needed to witness the actual mechanics of her daily deception. I drove home that evening, but I did not sleep a single wink. I spent the entire long night pacing the hardwood floors of my study, drawing upon decades of highly ruthless corporate strategy. When a rival construction firm attempted a hostile takeover of my company 20 years ago, I did not win by throwing a public tantrum. I won by quietly gathering irrefutable financial data, mapping out their hidden vulnerabilities, and striking only when my legal victory was absolutely guaranteed. Monica was executing a hostile takeover of my beloved son, his highly successful firm, and his extensive personal assets. I had to treat her like the incredibly dangerous corporate predator she actually was. The very next afternoon, I returned to the Lincoln Park estate. I deliberately parked my car 3 blocks away on a quiet, tree-lined side street. I walked briskly toward the rear of the massive property. I knew every single square inch of this expensive perimeter. I had personally supervised the installation of the high stone privacy walls and the heavy wrought iron gates. I easily located the small discreet service entrance hidden behind a thick row of tall cedar bushes. I quietly unlatched the heavy wooden gate and slipped silently into the expansive, meticulously manicured backyard. I moved with deliberate, practiced stealth, keeping my large frame entirely hidden behind the thick trunks of mature oak trees and the large marble fountains. I slowly crept toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the bright rear sunroom. The heavy velvet curtains were partially drawn, leaving a narrow, clear gap that provided an unobstructed, highly revealing view directly into the informal dining area. I pressed my back firmly against the cold stone facade of the house, holding my breath, and carefully peered through the thick, tempered glass. Bradley was seated at the heavy mahogany dining table. He was slumped precariously in a high-backed chair, his head lolling lazily to one side. He looked even worse than he had the previous day. His complexion was a terrifying, sickly shade of gray, and his arms rested limply on the polished wood surface like broken branches. Monica was standing directly beside him. On the table, sitting perfectly under the bright glow of the crystal chandelier, was the exact same heavy stainless steel thermal lunchbox I had intercepted on the front porch just days earlier. I watched with a rapidly beating heart as she calmly unscrewed the thick metal lid. She did not pull out a healthy, nutritious meal. She did not produce fresh fruit or a balanced salad. Instead, she carefully extracted one of the large, tightly sealed glass bottles I had seen in the diner. Even from my hidden vantage point outside the thick glass, I could easily recognize the opaque, milky white liquid sloshing sluggishly inside the heavy container. It did not look like any natural health smoothie. It looked incredibly dense, highly chemical, and deeply unnatural. Monica poured the thick, cloudy liquid into a tall glass. She then reached into the deep pocket of her designer cardigan. I strained my eyes, pressing my face closer to the cold window pane. She pulled out a tiny, dark amber vial and a small medical dropper. My stomach twisted violently. It was the exact same hidden substance Patricia had warned me about. With practiced, terrifyingly steady hands, Monica drew a highly precise microscopic measurement of the clear, toxic fluid from the amber vial. She hovered the delicate glass dropper directly over the tall glass of the milky smoothie and squeezed out exactly 3 distinct drops. She stirred the contaminated mixture slowly, with a long silver spoon, the metal clinking softly against the glass in a rhythmic, deeply sinister melody. She picked up the heavily laced drink and moved closer to my helpless son. "Bradley, darling, it is time for your afternoon nutrition," she cooed softly. Even through the thick window, I could easily read the sickly sweet, heavily exaggerated shape of her smiling lips. She placed her left hand gently on the back of his neck, her manicured fingers twisting into his dark hair, forcing his heavy head to remain upright. She brought the edge of the glass directly to his pale lips. Bradley weakly turned his head away, his face contorting in a brief flash of genuine physical revulsion. "No," he mumbled faintly, his weak voice barely penetrating the thick glass separating us. "It tastes completely awful. It makes me feel so sick." "Shush now, my sweet, exhausted boy," Monica murmured, her tone completely dripping with fake controlling pity. "You know the specialist said this is exactly what your poor, stressed brain desperately needs. You have to drink it all to get better. For me, darling. Be a good husband for me." She did not give him a choice. She forcefully tipped the tall glass upward, pressing the cold rim hard against his teeth, forcing the thick, opaque liquid directly into his mouth. Bradley gagged violently, his throat bobbing in a desperate, primitive attempt to reject the foul chemical substance. Some of the milky liquid spilled out, running down his chin and staining his shirt. But Monica was completely relentless. She rubbed his throat firmly, employing a harsh physical technique to physically force the swallowing reflex, all while maintaining that horrifying, serene, angelic smile. My hands balled into tight, trembling fists. My 40 years of deeply honed business instincts screamed loudly in my ears. This was absolutely not executive burnout. This was not a holistic vitamin therapy meant to cure exhaustion. This was a highly systematic, incredibly deliberate pacification. She was keeping him in a constant, medically induced twilight state, rendering him entirely incapable of managing his own life or his highly lucrative company. I stepped back from the cold glass window, my mind completely clear and terrifyingly focused. I realized right then that I could not fight her with mere emotional outrage or loud, unsubstantiated accusations. The medical establishment was thoroughly fooled. She held his medical power of attorney. If I wanted to save my poor son, I needed bulletproof, undeniable, irrefutable data. I needed hard evidence that would permanently destroy her. I walked carefully back to my hidden car, my resolve completely absolute. I would hire the best private investigators in the state to expose her toxic web of terrible, deadly lies. I did not waste a single second after retreating from that window. I knew my son was medicated and incapable of calling for help. I retreated to the edge of the property, concealing myself within the thick shadows of the oak trees. I waited with the calculating stillness of a seasoned predator. My 40 years of business experience taught me that arrogant people inevitably make careless mistakes. About 20 minutes later, I heard the muted sound of heavy plumbing kicking in from the second floor. The rush of water echoing through the copper pipes meant Monica was drawing a bath. I knew her daily routines from my previous visits. A bath for Monica was a prolonged, luxurious affair that would easily occupy her for half an hour. This was my golden window of opportunity. I moved swiftly and silently across the manicured lawn. I gripped the heavy brass handle of the rear patio door, praying she had not engaged the complex security system. The handle turned smoothly. I slipped inside, the thick soles of my boots muffled by the plush Persian rugs decorating the hardwood floors. The house was deathly quiet save for the rushing water upstairs. I navigated the familiar layout with extreme caution, passing the dark living room, where Bradley was likely still slumped in his induced twilight sleep. I bypassed him entirely, forcing my heart to harden against the painful sight of my broken son. My immediate target was the massive custom marble kitchen island. Monica treated this central space as her personal command center, constantly organizing her life, managing the household, and apparently plotting her hostile corporate takeover. I approached the island, my eyes scanning the pristine surface. It was mostly clear, displaying only a bowl of fresh fruit and a stack of wide-rolled architectural blueprints. These thick paper tubes belonged to Bradley, representing highly lucrative commercial projects his firm was currently bidding on. But something about their placement felt incredibly deliberate. They were stacked far too neatly for a man supposedly suffering from severe executive burnout. I reached out with trembling hands and carefully lifted the heavy stack of blue paper. Beneath the architectural plans lay a sleek black leather portfolio. It was not one of Bradley's typical work folders. It bore the embossed golden logo of a highly prestigious, aggressive corporate law firm located downtown. My breath hitched as I flipped it open. The very first document was printed on thick, heavy legal paper. The bold black header jumped off the page, instantly confirming my worst, most terrifying suspicions. It was an ironclad, incredibly comprehensive, durable power of attorney. I quickly scanned the dense legal jargon, my blood running colder with every single line I read. This was not a standard medical directive meant for temporary emergencies. This document was a total, unmitigated transfer of human agency. It granted Monica absolute, unquestionable authority over every single aspect of Bradley's life. It gave her the unilateral power to make all his medical decisions, to admit him to psychiatric facilities against his will, and to forcefully administer medications she deemed necessary without requiring secondary medical consent. It was essentially a legal license to keep him permanently drugged and completely isolated. But the horror did not stop at his physical autonomy. The document extended its dark tentacles deep into his immense financial empire. It granted her total access to his personal bank accounts, his massive investment portfolios, and his highly lucrative real estate holdings. She could simply liquidate his assets and completely wipe out his personal wealth with a single stroke. I flipped past the power of attorney, my hands shaking with a mixture of profound grief and explosive righteous anger. The next document in the black portfolio was even more devastating. It was a highly complex corporate restructuring agreement drafted specifically for Harrison Architectural Associates. It was a formal motion to permanently transfer all of Bradley's majority voting rights and his title of Chief Executive Officer into a newly formed, deeply opaque blind trust. And the sole uncontested trustee named in this complicated legal maneuver was Monica. The conflict was no longer merely a medical emergency or a case of severe spousal abuse. This was a highly calculated, ruthless corporate coup. She was systematically poisoning my son to artificially fabricate a severe mental decline. She was intentionally creating a documented medical history of exhaustion, erratic behavior, and psychological instability. Once Bradley was deemed completely unfit to run his own life, she would effortlessly execute these legal documents. She would take absolute control of the multi-million-dollar company I painstakingly built from the ground up and proudly hand it over to my son. She was actively stealing our entire family legacy right out from under us. I pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket, making sure the camera flash was completely disabled. I began photographing every single page of the damning documents. I took highly detailed, crystal-clear pictures of the power of attorney, the blind trust transfer, and the attached medical evaluations from her fraudulent holistic clinic. I captured the signatures, the dates, and the specific names of the corrupt corporate lawyers she was actively colluding with. Every digital snapshot was a loaded weapon I intended to fire directly at her meticulously crafted life. As I photographed the final page, a chilling realization settled heavily over my mind. Monica had orchestrated everything from the very beginning. The sudden onset of his symptoms, the isolation from his friends, the restriction of his digital devices. It was all part of her sinister design. She had flawlessly manipulated the narrative, painting herself as the tragic, suffering wife bravely caring for her broken husband, while secretly slipping poison into his daily nutritional smoothies. She was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and emotional gaslighting. I carefully placed the black leather portfolio exactly where I had found it, gently lowering the architectural blueprints back over it. I listened intently to the ambient sounds of the large house. The bathwater upstairs had finally stopped running. I knew my window of opportunity was closing. I quietly backed away from the kitchen island, my phone secured in my pocket, loaded with the undeniable proof I needed. I slipped back through the silent living room, casting one final glance at my semi-conscious son. He was staring blankly at the far wall, oblivious to the invisible war raging around him. "Hold on just a little longer, Bradley," I whispered fiercely. "I am going to end this nightmare." I exited through the patio door, silently pulling it shut until the latch clicked into place. I melted back into the shadows of the large oak trees, moving purposefully toward the service gate. As I walked to my car, the evening air felt invigorating against my heated skin. The crippling fear that had plagued me for days was gone, replaced by a cold resolve. Monica thought she could outsmart me. She thought she could drug my son, steal my legacy, and cast me aside as a clueless old man. But she forgot I spent 40 years surviving in a ruthless industry. I knew how to dismantle hostile operations. I climbed into my vehicle and started the engine. The battle lines were drawn. I pulled away from this quiet, tree-lined street, ensuring my headlights remained off until I was several blocks away from their massive estate. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel with a terrifying calmness. The frantic, suffocating panic that had gripped me in the emergency room was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating, and deeply lethal clarity. Monica believed she had flawlessly executed the perfect crime. She thought she had effectively neutralized me by painting me as a paranoid, grieving, and deeply confused old man. I had gladly let her believe that carefully constructed illusion. Playing the role of the defeated, forgetful senior citizen was the ultimate false surrender. It gave her a dangerous sense of absolute security, blinding her to the massive retaliation I was actively mobilizing in the shadows. I navigated the heavy evening traffic, driving straight toward the gritty industrial sector of the city. I was not going to the police. I was not going back to the hospital. Law enforcement and medical professionals operate within the rigid confines of standard procedures, plausible deniability, and bureaucratic red tape. Monica had already proven she could effortlessly manipulate those exact systems using her fake tears and her fraudulent holistic clinic paperwork. To dismantle a ruthless, highly organized predator, I needed someone who operated entirely outside those predictable constraints. I needed a ghost. I reached into my jacket, pulled out my secured secondary phone, and dialed a number I had not used in over a decade. The line rang 3 times before a deep, gravelly voice answered without a formal greeting. "Thomas," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "It is William Harrison. I need your unique skill set immediately." Thomas was a highly decorated, incredibly ruthless former federal investigator. 20 years ago, when my construction empire was facing severe, completely illegal extortion attempts from a highly corrupt labor union. Thomas was the man who quietly dismantled their entire operation. He did not use standard subpoenas or polite interviews. He operated in the absolute darkest corners of the intelligence world, extracting hidden financial records, deleted communications, and buried secrets with surgical, terrifying precision. He owed me a significant favor, and I was finally calling it in. We met an hour later in the dimly lit, completely soundproofed back room of a private cigar lounge downtown. Thomas sat across from me in a heavy leather chair. He was a broad, imposing man with sharp, analytical eyes that missed absolutely nothing. I did not waste time with pleasantries or emotional vulnerability. I placed my smartphone directly on the polished wooden table between us and opened the encrypted photo gallery. I showed him the high-resolution images I had just taken inside my son's house. I showed him the ironclad power of attorney, the corporate blind trust transfer, and the fraudulent medical evaluations. "This woman is my daughter-in-law," I explained, my tone strictly business. "She is systematically poisoning my son to artificially fabricate a severe psychological decline. She is planning a complete hostile takeover of his architectural firm and his entire personal fortune. She has manipulated the medical establishment and isolated him from the world. I need you to completely tear her life apart." Thomas leaned forward carefully, scrolling through the digital images. His face remained an unreadable, stony mask. "What exactly do you want me to find, William?" he asked quietly. "I want absolutely everything," I demanded, leaning in closer. "I want you to dig relentlessly into her past. I want every single deleted email, every hidden text message, and every encrypted phone call she has made in the last 2 years. I want you to trace every dollar she has ever spent. Dig into her background before she met Bradley. Predators like Monica do not just suddenly appear out of thin air. They have highly destructive patterns. They leave broken people and shattered finances in their wake. Find her previous victims. But most importantly, I need you to investigate that so-called holistic wellness clinic. Find out exactly who those corporate lawyers are on the trust documents. Expose the entire network she is utilizing to execute this corporate coup. Thomas nodded slowly, slipping a small encrypted drive onto the table to transfer the photos. Consider it done, William. She will not have a single digital secret left by the time I am finished with her. I left the cigar lounge feeling a powerful surge of momentum, but I knew digital evidence was only half the battle. Thomas would expose her financial motives and her hidden communications, but I still needed irrefutable scientific proof of the actual physical poisoning. The emergency room doctor had smugly dismissed my concerns because a standard hospital toxicology screen only looks for common narcotics, heavy metals, or basic poisons. Monica was using something far more sophisticated, a highly specialized synthetic compound designed specifically to evade standard medical detection. I needed a chemical analysis that an emergency room blood panel could never possibly catch. I drove directly across the city to a quiet suburban neighborhood. I pulled into the driveway of a modest brick house and walked up to the front door. Patricia, the retired head trauma nurse who had first warned me about the lunchbox, opened the door immediately. She looked incredibly relieved to see me standing there. "William," she breathed, pulling me inside. "I have been worried sick. How is Bradley? Is he safe?" "He is alive, but he is certainly not safe," I replied grimly. Monica manipulated the emergency room doctors. She produced fake holistic prescriptions. They completely bought her act and sent him back home to her. She is actively hand-feeding him the substance right now. "I need a physical sample, Patricia." But the hospital gave the original vials back to her when they discharged him. Patricia offered a tight, deeply knowing smile and reached into her cardigan pocket. When we were sitting in the diner, I recognized the severe danger instantly, she said softly. I used my sleight of hand. I discreetly pocketed one of the 6 amber vials before you closed the lunchbox. I knew you might desperately need an untainted sample. She handed me the tiny, heavy glass vial completely sealed and perfectly intact. I felt a massive wave of gratitude wash over me. "You are a genuine lifesaver, Patricia," I whispered, securing the crucial evidence in my inner jacket pocket. I left Patricia's house and made my final, most critical call of the night. During my decades of building commercial hospitals and high-tech research facilities, I had cultivated deep, mutually beneficial relationships with some of the most brilliant scientific minds in the medical community. I dialed the private number of an independent forensic toxicologist, a highly eccentric scientist, who operated a state-of-the-art chemical laboratory entirely off the books. He was a man who answered strictly to science, completely unburdened by hospital bureaucracy or standard clinical limitations. I met him at his secure laboratory facility just past midnight. I walked into the intensely sterile environment and placed the amber vial directly onto his stainless steel examination table. "I need a complete molecular breakdown," I instructed him. "Find it. The downfall begins now." The toxicologist gave me a grim nod, securing the tiny amber vial inside a heavy steel refrigeration unit. He promised a preliminary report within 48 hours, warning me that extracting synthetic compounds from complex organic mixtures was a deeply intricate process. I thanked him and walked back out into the cold night air. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a harsh green, displaying 2 in the morning. I was physically exhausted, my bones aching with the heavy burden of age, but my mind was completely wired. Thomas was actively tearing through Monica's digital footprint, and the chemist was decoding her poison. But neither of those crucial operations helped my son right now. Bradley was still trapped inside that massive house entirely at the mercy of a woman who was methodically destroying his central nervous system. I could not simply wait for the investigative reports while she continued to dose him. If I called the authorities prematurely, she would flush the remaining evidence and claim the single vial I possessed was planted. I needed to keep her completely confident, entirely secure in her twisted routine, but I had to stop the poison from entering my son's body. I needed to cut the supply line without severing the fragile string of her grand illusion. By the time I reached my quiet condominium, a highly daring, deeply risky plan had fully materialized in my mind. I needed to infiltrate the Lincoln Park estate, locate her primary stash of the concentrated compound, and physically replace the toxic liquid with a completely harmless substitute. It was a massive gamble. If she noticed the subtle change in viscosity, color, or volume, she would immediately know she was being hunted. She might panic and escalate her timeline, potentially doing something incredibly drastic to secure her control over the architectural firm. I spent the remainder of the long weekend meticulously preparing for my silent heist. I visited a specialized holistic pharmacy across town, purchasing several organic herbal tinctures, thick milk thistle extracts, and cloudy liquid vitamins. I spent hours alone in my kitchen blending the natural ingredients in various glass beakers until I perfectly matched the dense milky white opacity and the heavy, sluggish viscosity of the vile liquid I had observed in the sunroom. I loaded my harmless, nutrient-rich counterfeit mixture into a sterile medical flask. I packed a precision syringe, a set of latex gloves, and a small measuring beaker into a nondescript leather satchel. My final piece of vital equipment was a heavy brass key resting at the bottom of my desk drawer. When Bradley and Monica first purchased the expansive property 3 years ago, my son had proudly given me a spare house key, insisting I should always feel completely welcome. Monica had undoubtedly forgotten I even possessed it, or she simply assumed I was too polite and deeply conditioned to ever use it unannounced. She severely underestimated the primal lengths a father will go to when his child is actively bleeding out in the dark. Monday dragged by in a state of agonizing suspense. I carefully tracked her rigid daily schedule. Monica was a creature of intense, absolute habit, wearing her expensive routines like a protective armor. Every single Tuesday morning, without fail, she attended a private 2-hour restorative yoga and meditation session at an exclusive studio located across the city. She always departed the estate at precisely 8:45 and never returned before noon. It was a solid 3-hour window of total emptiness. I woke up well before dawn on Tuesday morning, drinking my black coffee in total silence. I drove toward Lincoln Park, parking my vehicle several blocks away in the crowded lot of a high-end grocery store. I walked the remaining distance on foot, blending in perfectly with the morning joggers and the busy dog walkers. At 8:40, I positioned myself behind the thick brick wall of the neighbor's property, completely out of the direct line of sight of her comprehensive security cameras. 5 minutes later, the heavy iron driveway gates swung open with a smooth mechanical hum. Monica's sleek black luxury sport utility vehicle rolled out onto the pristine pavement. I watched her perfectly styled hair through the tinted glass as she turned down the long avenue, driving away to find her inner peace while actively leaving a nightmare behind. I waited exactly 10 agonizing minutes to ensure she had not forgotten something trivial and turned back around. When the street remained completely silent, I moved with rapid, calculated precision. I approached the heavy mahogany front door, retrieving the cold brass key from my leather satchel. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs, a loud, frantic drumbeat echoing in my own ears. I slid the metal key into the intricate lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. I pushed the door open and stepped quickly into the grand, sunlit foyer, immediately pulling the door softly shut behind me. The massive house was entirely silent, possessing the heavy, muted stillness of a museum. I pulled the tight latex gloves onto my hands, the sharp snap of the rubber sounding incredibly loud in the quiet space. I walked past the formal living area, completely ignoring the expensive modern art and the plush designer furniture. I headed straight for the massive open-concept kitchen. I knew Monica kept the large milky bottles in the thermal lunchbox when she was actively feeding him, but she had to maintain a larger bulk supply, somewhere highly discreet, but easily accessible. I systematically moved through the custom wooden cabinetry, bypassing the fine china and the imported crystal glasses. I reached the deep walk-in pantry, located just behind the commercial-grade refrigerator. It was a meticulously organized space lined with matching glass containers of organic grains, expensive imported teas, and rows of high-end nutritional supplements. I dropped to my knees, scanning the bottom shelves, searching for anything out of place. Tucked far away in the darkest back corner, cleverly concealed behind several large, bulky boxes of loose-leaf chamomile tea, sat a sleek, unmarked black lockbox. It was secured by a basic 4-digit combination dial. I paused, my mind racing through the mathematical possibilities. Monica was deeply vain and entirely self-obsessed. She would use something she deemed highly significant to her own personal narrative. I slowly dialed the exact date Bradley had officially signed the preliminary corporate documents making her the vice president of the architectural firm. The heavy metal clasp immediately released with a soft, incredibly distinct click. I opened the black lid, holding my breath in pure anticipation. Inside the dark container sat 3 large, thick glass bottles filled with the exact same opaque, milky chemical liquid. I unzipped my leather satchel and pulled out the sterile medical syringe and my flask of harmless herbal substitute. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the smooth plastic barrel. I extracted exactly 50 milliliters of the concentrated synthetic poison and meticulously injected exactly 50 milliliters of the harmless mixture back into her large glass bottle. I repeated this tense process for every bottle, ensuring my son would finally wake up soon. I carefully closed the sleek black lockbox, ensuring the 4-digit combination dial was scrambled back to a completely random sequence. I pushed the heavy container deep into the dark corner of the walk-in pantry, meticulously rearranging the bulky boxes of organic chamomile tea to perfectly conceal my daring intrusion. I zipped my leather satchel shut, my heart still pounding, a frantic heavy rhythm against my ribs. I walked swiftly back through the grand foyer, wiping the brass doorknob with my sleeve to remove any trace of my physical presence. I locked the heavy front door and slipped out through the concealed service gate just as the distant hum of a landscaping truck echoed down the affluent street. I reached my parked vehicle with exactly 12 minutes to spare before Monica's restorative yoga session officially concluded. The delicate chemical swap was completely successful, but the most excruciating part of my desperate mission had only just begun. The next 3 days were a profound masterclass in psychological torture. I was a man accustomed to taking immediate decisive action, breaking ground on massive commercial developments the moment a contract was signed. Now I was forced to sit in the suffocating silence of my condominium, waiting for the forensic toxicologist to decode the stolen chemical sample and waiting for Thomas to extract the digital blueprints of Monica's criminal conspiracy. Every single hour felt like a grueling eternity. I had to maintain the perfect illusion of the defeated, overbearing father. I called Monica every afternoon, playing the role of the anxious senior citizen, politely asking for brief supervised visits with my ailing son. She graciously allowed me exactly 30 minutes each day, clearly relishing her absolute control over my access to Bradley. When I arrived for my daily visits, the atmosphere in the Lincoln Park estate was deeply suffocating. Monica played the role of the devoted, exhausted caretaker to absolute perfection. She greeted me at the door with a perfectly practiced, weary smile, speaking in hushed, dramatic tones about how difficult the neurological recovery process was proving to be. I forced myself to nod sympathetically, swallowing the acidic bile of pure hatred that rose in my throat every time she touched his shoulder or smoothed his hair. I sat in the living room watching her hand him the tall glasses of the thick, milky liquid. She watched him swallow every single drop, entirely unaware that she was now feeding him harmless milk thistle and organic vitamins instead of her highly concentrated synthetic poison. I watched Bradley with a deeply guarded, intense vigilance, terrified that my counterfeit mixture might somehow harm him, or that a sudden chemical withdrawal might trigger a severe medical crisis. But by the second afternoon, I began to notice a profound, truly miraculous shift. The heavy, deathly gray pallor that had masked his handsome face was slowly beginning to fade, replaced by the faintest hint of healthy color. His posture in the deep leather armchair was no longer entirely liquid and boneless. He was sitting slightly more upright, his hands gripping the armrests, with a weak but deliberate intent. The thick, foggy veil covering his eyes was gradually lifting, revealing brief, agonizing flashes of profound confusion and deep underlying terror. He was slowly waking up from the dark chemical nightmare she had deliberately trapped him in. On the third day of my unannounced substitution, the breakthrough finally happened. I arrived at the estate just as a heavy afternoon rainstorm began to lash violently against the tall glass windows. Monica was highly agitated, complaining bitterly about a delayed delivery of expensive catering for an upcoming social luncheon she was planning. She ushered me into the living room where Bradley was sitting quietly on the large designer sofa. He looked significantly sharper today, his eyes actively tracking my movements as I entered the room. The vacant stare was completely gone, replaced by a frantic darting and incredibly desperate anxiety. "I need to go speak directly with the delivery driver at the front gate," Monica announced sharply, checking her designer watch with deep irritation. "Watch him for 2 minutes, William. Do not let him try to stand up. He is still incredibly weak." She turned on her heel and marched out of the room, her heavy footsteps echoing down the long hallway toward the front entrance. The moment the heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind her, the entire atmosphere in the living room shifted dramatically. Bradley's head snapped up. He looked directly into my eyes, and for the first time in several weeks, I saw the brilliant, driven architect I had raised. The heavy chemical lethargy was entirely gone, leaving behind a raw, unfiltered, and deeply visceral panic. He leaned forward awkwardly, his hands reaching out to grab my forearm with a weak, heavily trembling grip. "Dad," he whispered. His voice was incredibly raspy, thoroughly stripped of its usual confident resonance, but the words were sharp and undeniably clear. "My head. Dad. My head feels so incredibly strange. It is like a thick, heavy fog is suddenly breaking apart." I leaned in close, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the hallway archway, acutely aware that Monica could return at any given second. I gripped his trembling hands securely in mine, squeezing them with quiet, desperate strength to anchor him to reality. "I am right here, Bradley," I murmured softly, my voice tight with heavily suppressed emotion. "I am right here with you." He swallowed hard, his eyes wide with a terrifying dawning realization of his deep physical captivity. "Dad, she will not let me leave." He choked out his words, rushing together in a desperate, hushed, and completely terrified plea. "She locks the doors. She took my phone away. Every time I drink what she gives me, the darkness comes right back. I cannot think properly. I cannot fight her at all. Please, Dad, you have to help me right now." My heart shattered into a million jagged pieces, hearing the absolute terror in my strong son's voice. The explicit confirmation of her unimaginable cruelty was a physical blow directly to my chest. But I could not afford to break down. I could not alert her to his rapidly returning lucidity. I leaned my forehead gently against his, projecting every single ounce of my formidable strength into his weakened body. "Hold on, son," I whispered with fierce, unyielding conviction, matching the quiet intensity of his desperate plea. "Just hold on a little bit longer. Do exactly what she says. Drink whatever she hands you without a fight. Do not let her know you are waking up. Daddy is fixing this. I promise you, I will completely end this nightmare." The sound of the front door opening echoed loudly. Monica's heels clicked rapidly. I instantly let go of his hands and leaned back, replacing my intense expression with a soft, clueless smile. Bradley slumped backward intelligently, mimicking his previous stupor, just as she glided back into the room. My secure phone vibrated heavily in my pocket. It was a message from Thomas. He had successfully found absolutely everything. The agonizing period of waiting was finally over. It was finally time to utterly destroy her. I left the Lincoln Park estate that afternoon, with my heart pounding, a steady rhythm of impending vengeance. I walked down the long driveway, keeping my posture slightly hunched and my steps perfectly slow to maintain the illusion for the security cameras. The moment I reached the safety of my vehicle, I locked the doors and pulled out my secure phone. The message from Thomas was brief, but it carried the weight of absolute victory. He had the financial records, the deleted emails, and the undeniable proof of her entire corporate conspiracy. But before I could even reply to his encrypted text, a second notification flashed across my screen. It was the private number of the independent forensic toxicologist. The preliminary molecular analysis of the stolen amber vial was finally complete. I started the engine and merged into the heavy Chicago traffic, driving straight toward the secure laboratory facility on the outskirts of the city. The rain continued to batter my windshield, washing away the grime of the day, perfectly mirroring the cleansing storm I was about to unleash upon Monica. When I arrived at the sterile facility, the eccentric chemist was already waiting for me in his private office. He did not offer a polite greeting or a comforting smile. He simply slid a thick, bound manila folder across the polished metal desk. His face was drawn tight with professional grimness and a deep underlying disgust. I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the complex chemical breakdowns and the highlighted summary printed on the very first page. I am not a medical professional, but decades of reviewing highly technical architectural engineering reports had trained my mind to quickly absorb complex data. I looked up at the toxicologist, waiting for him to translate the dense scientific jargon into plain, actionable English. "This is not a holistic vitamin therapy," the chemist stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "It is absolutely not a high dose of vitamin B12 or an organic neurological supplement, as the fraudulent label claims. What you brought me is a highly concentrated, incredibly potent synthetic liquid formulation. The primary active ingredient is haloperidol." The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I needed the exact clinical context. "Haloperidol," he continued, leaning forward and tapping the paper with a silver pen, "is a very heavy first-generation antipsychotic medication. It is typically utilized in severe psychiatric wards to immediately subdue highly violent, actively hallucinating, or completely uncontrollable patients. It functions by forcefully blocking the dopamine receptors deep within the brain. It drastically suppresses motor function, crushes cognitive processing, and induces a state of profound, overwhelming lethargy. In standard pill form, it is highly regulated. In this concentrated liquid format, administered consistently over a period of weeks, it is an incredibly effective tool for total human subjugation." My blood ran completely cold. I thought of Bradley slumped in that leather chair, his brilliant mind trapped behind a thick wall of forced chemical suppression. "But that is not the only substance in the vial," the toxicologist added, turning to the second page of the report. "The haloperidol has been meticulously blended with a powerful, fast-acting muscle relaxant. This specific combination is incredibly insidious. The antipsychotic completely crushes his cognitive ability to think, to reason, or to fight back mentally. The muscle relaxant systematically destroys his physical ability to move, to stand up, or to escape. She is literally dissolving the connection between his brain and his body." The sheer, unadulterated evil of her methodology hit me with the force of a freight train. Monica was not trying to murder my son. If she simply wanted him dead, she could have easily administered a fatal overdose on the very first night and played the role of the grieving widow. But a sudden, unexplained death of a wealthy, healthy 35-year-old chief executive officer would immediately trigger a massive police investigation, a mandatory autopsy, and an intense legal scrutiny of his corporate assets. The life insurance payout would be substantial, but it would completely pale in comparison to the total ongoing value of his incredibly lucrative architectural firm. She did not want a one-time payout. She wanted the absolute, uncontested control of the entire empire. To achieve that massive goal, she needed him alive but entirely incapacitated. She was executing a slow, methodical chemical lobotomy. By keeping him in a constant medically induced stupor, she was expertly manufacturing a highly documented, irrefutable medical history of severe psychological collapse. The fraudulent clinic was steadily building a paper trail of his supposed executive burnout, his sudden cognitive decline, and his inability to perform basic executive functions. She was parading him in front of doctors, colleagues, and even his own father as a broken, rapidly deteriorating man. Once the narrative was firmly established in the public and medical record, no judge in the state would ever question the execution of that ironclad power of attorney. She would legally declare him entirely incompetent, slide seamlessly into the role of the sole trustee, and completely usurp his voting rights. She would lock him away in an expensive psychiatric care facility under her total control while she freely liquidated the assets I had spent my entire life building. It was a masterpiece of corporate theft executed through the profound physical torture of the man she had sworn to love and protect. I thanked the toxicologist, taking the heavy manila folder and locking it securely inside my leather briefcase. The forensic evidence was completely undeniable. The chemical signature of the poison perfectly aligned with the legal timeline of the drafted corporate documents I had photographed in her kitchen. I left the laboratory and drove directly to a secure private meeting room at a downtown hotel where Thomas was already waiting for me. I walked into the room and placed the toxicology report directly onto the table next to his open laptop. "It is a heavy antipsychotic mixed with a severe muscle relaxant," I told him, my voice practically vibrating with suppressed rage. "She is chemically lobotomizing him to steal the company." Thomas did not look surprised. He simply opened a digital file on his screen and turned the monitor toward me. "Your chemical analysis perfectly matches the financial trail I just uncovered," he said, his tone utterly clinical. "Monica has been incredibly busy over the last 8 months. Before she met your son, she was drowning in massive credit card debt and facing severe legal action from 2 previous landlords. She is a highly sophisticated grifter. But the most important piece of data is the holistic wellness clinic. It is not a legitimate medical practice. It is a shell corporation entirely funded by a group of incredibly aggressive, highly unethical venture capitalists. Those are the exact same individuals sitting on the board of the blind trust she intends to transfer Bradley's voting rights into." I stared at the screen, watching the complicated web of fraudulent wire transfers, hidden offshore bank accounts, and deleted encrypted text messages outlining the entire horrific conspiracy. They were actively paying off the corrupt medical professionals to provide the synthetic haloperidol and fabricate the fraudulent medical records. This was the absolute end now. I sat in the sterile hotel meeting room, letting the crushing weight of Thomas's digital presentation wash over me. The sheer scale of the financial conspiracy was staggering, yet it perfectly aligned with the horrific medical reality I had just uncovered. Monica was not merely a greedy spouse acting on a sudden impulse. She was a highly calculated operative functioning as the vital linchpin in a massive, deeply coordinated corporate syndicate. I reached out and slowly closed the lid of Thomas's laptop, plunging the room into a heavy, contemplative silence. I thought I had uncovered the absolute bottom of this treacherous abyss, but my ruthless investigator was far from finished. Thomas leaned back in his heavy leather chair, his sharp eyes studying my face with a profound, grim intensity. He reached down into his worn leather briefcase resting on the carpeted floor and produced a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope. He placed it squarely in the center of the polished mahogany table right next to my damning toxicology report. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood sounded like a gavel striking a judge's bench. "This is the physical documentation, William," he stated quietly, his voice lacking its usual abrasive edge. "I suggest you brace yourself, because the financial trail and the fake holistic clinic are only the corporate mechanics of this operation. The personal motivation is infinitely more disturbing." I stared at the thick, unmarked envelope, feeling a sudden icy knot twist violently deep inside my gut. My decades of navigating treacherous business negotiations had trained me to anticipate nearly every possible angle of betrayal, but Thomas's serious demeanor signaled a deeply personal violation that completely transcended corporate theft. I picked up the envelope, the rough texture of the thick paper scraping against my dry fingertips. What exactly did you find? Thomas, I asked, my voice dropping to a low, incredibly dangerous register. Did she hire a secondary assassin to finish the job once the legal documents were finalized? Thomas shook his head slowly, refusing to break eye contact. No, William, he replied firmly. She did not need to hire an outside assassin. She already had an inside man intimately embedded within the absolute highest levels of your son's daily life. Open the file. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the heavy wax seal and pulled out a thick stack of high-resolution 8x10 surveillance photographs. The very first image was a perfectly clear, brightly lit shot of a highly exclusive, intensely private boutique hotel located in the wealthiest district of the city. The timestamp, printed cleanly in the bottom corner, indicated the photograph had been taken just 3 days ago. During the exact same afternoon, Monica claimed she was attending an intensive holistic healing seminar for caregiver support. I shuffled quickly to the second photograph in the heavy stack. It showed Monica stepping out of her black luxury sport utility vehicle, handing her keys to the uniformed hotel valet with a brilliantly radiant, completely unburdened smile. She was not wearing her usual conservative, exhausted caregiver attire. She was dressed in an incredibly expensive, highly provocative designer gown, looking absolutely stunning and entirely free of the tremendous marital burden she so loudly complained about to my son's colleagues. My stomach churned violently as I moved to the third image. It captured Monica walking gracefully into the dimly lit, highly secluded rear courtyard of the hotel restaurant. But she was not dining alone. Sitting across from her, at an intimately small candle-lit table, was a man dressed in a sharp-tailored charcoal suit. His back was turned to the hidden camera lens obscuring his facial features, but his posture radiated a deeply familiar, incredibly relaxed confidence. I stared at the broad shoulders and the distinct cut of his expensive suit jacket. A powerful wave of chilling recognition slowly creeping up the back of my neck. I knew this man. I knew his confident stance, the specific way he leaned over the table, and the expensive gold watch gleaming brightly on his left wrist. Turn to the fifth photograph, Thomas instructed softly, his sharp eyes tracking my rapid, heavy breathing. I pulled the fourth image away, revealing the fifth picture in the damning sequence. The hidden camera angle had shifted significantly, providing a crystal-clear, unobstructed view of the couple's intimate interaction. Monica was leaning entirely across the small table, her hands intimately cupping the man's face. Their lips were locked in a deeply passionate, incredibly familiar kiss that spoke of a long-standing, highly practiced physical relationship. This was not a sudden, reckless indiscretion or a momentary lapse of marital judgment. This was an established, deeply entrenched romantic partnership, operating entirely in the shadows, while my son lay paralyzed and chemically subjugated in his own living room. The sheer audacity of her brazen betrayal sent a blinding spike of pure, unadulterated fury shooting directly through my veins. She was casually enjoying romantic, candle-lit interludes while actively orchestrating a horrifying chemical lobotomy on her legally bound husband. I tightened my grip on the glossy photograph, the edges of the thick paper bending under the immense crushing pressure of my trembling fingers. I stared fiercely at the man's face fully exposed in the ambient glow of the courtyard lighting. The air completely rushed out of my burning lungs as the man's identity finally crystallized in my reeling mind. It was Gregory. Gregory, the brilliant, incredibly ambitious senior corporate attorney I had personally mentored and heavily recommended to Bradley 5 years ago. He was not just Bradley's deeply trusted in-house counsel. He was a highly privileged minority business partner holding a critical 10% ownership stake in the architectural firm. Gregory was the man who had drafted all of Bradley's original, legitimate corporate contracts. He knew every single vulnerability, every hidden financial asset, and every complex legal loophole within my son's massive company. The devastating realization crashed over me like a massive tidal wave of jagged, shattered glass. The brutal betrayal cut twice as deep, slicing violently through the very core of my trusting heart. Monica was not acting alone. She had actively seduced the one man who held the absolute legal keys to the entire architectural kingdom. Gregory was the corrupt architect behind the ironclad power of attorney and the fraudulent blind trust documents I had discovered hidden in the kitchen. He had intentionally weaponized his intimate legal knowledge to completely dismantle his trusting friend and business partner. Together, they were executing a flawless, two-pronged attack, seamlessly blending medical poisoning with airtight legal theft. They believed they were absolutely invincible. I carefully placed the glossy photograph back down onto the polished mahogany table, my entire body vibrating with a terrifying absolute and profoundly lethal calmness. This specific revelation changed everything about my ultimate strategy. I was no longer just fighting a single greedy wife. I was actively waging war against a highly sophisticated legal operation. I stared deeply into Thomas's eyes, fully understanding the massive scope of the perilous battlefield before me. We were not merely stopping a toxic medical manipulation. We were completely dismantling a heavily fortified, incredibly ruthless criminal enterprise from the ground up. I instructed Thomas to maintain absolute surveillance on both Monica and Gregory while I returned to my condominium. The devastating revelation of their illicit affair had fundamentally altered the entire landscape of this horrific ordeal. This was no longer simply a case of a greedy spouse seeking an early inheritance or a frustrated wife trying to gain domestic control. This was a synchronized, legally impenetrable extraction of immense wealth. I needed to understand the exact corporate mechanism they intended to use to finalize their theft. During the initial founding of Harrison Architectural Associates, I had personally guided Bradley through the complex, treacherous labyrinth of corporate structuring. I had advised him on asset protection, liability shields, and partner equity distribution. I walked directly into my study, unlocked the heavy steel filing cabinet tucked beneath my bookshelves, and pulled out the original foundational binders of my son's architectural firm. I spread the thick, densely typed operating agreements across the smooth surface of my mahogany desk. My eyes scanned the familiar legal clauses, searching for the specific trapdoor Gregory was planning to spring. As an insider, the minority partner and the firm's chief legal counsel, Gregory, knew this complex document better than anyone else. He had drafted the recent corporate amendments himself. I pored over the shareholder agreements, the equity distribution models, and the strict corporate bylaws, reading late into the silent, dark night. Just past 3 a.m, the lethal mechanism finally revealed itself. It was buried deep within a highly convoluted, incredibly dense addendum attached to the primary partnership contract. It was a specific variation of a standard legal protocol commonly referred to in corporate law as a buy-sell agreement or an incapacity trigger. I had initially recommended a similar protective measure years ago to shield the growing company from external liquidation in the event of a sudden tragic accident involving my son. However, Gregory had subtly modified the specific legal language during a recent routine contract update. It was an update Bradley had undoubtedly signed without a second thought, completely trusting his closest friend and primary legal advisor. The heavily modified clause explicitly detailed the protocol for permanent medical incapacitation. If the majority shareholder, my son Bradley, was formally declared mentally incompetent or permanently unable to fulfill his executive duties, the minority partner was granted an exclusive non-negotiable right of first refusal to purchase the remaining outstanding shares. But it was the specific valuation metric attached to this seemingly standard clause that made my blood run entirely cold. It completely circumvented the current fair market value of the thriving company. Instead, it relied on a severely outdated, heavily depreciated baseline formula from the company's first year of operation. Harrison Architectural Associates was currently valued at a highly conservative estimate of exactly $50 million. Bradley proudly owned 90% of that massive, thriving enterprise. Yet under the explicit deceptive terms of this deeply buried incapacity clause, Gregory would be legally permitted to execute a hostile buyout of Bradley's entire majority stake for a strictly capped fractionally nominal fee of precisely $2 million. The sheer mathematical brutality of their master plan was breathtaking. But a forced corporate buyout required the incapacitated partner's legal representative to formally authorize the grossly undervalued sale. That was the exact moment the final terrifying puzzle piece clicked into perfect place. That was the sole sinister purpose of the ironclad, durable power of attorney I had photographed inside Monica's hidden black portfolio. Monica was the designated uncontested agent. Once Bradley was heavily medicated, locked securely inside a psychiatric facility, and legally stripped of his human agency, would eagerly step forward as his sole legal guardian. She would cheerfully sign the corporate release forms on his behalf, willingly accepting Gregory's insulting $2 million buyout. She would legally surrender a $50 million empire for pennies on the dollar, and the local courts would blindly bless the transaction as a necessary medical liquidation. It was a completely seamless, legally binding transfer of massive wealth. The absolute genius of their conspiracy was its complete and utter legality. On paper, to any outside observer or financial auditor, it would look exactly like a tragic, unfortunate medical collapse, followed by a messy but legally sound corporate transition. Gregory would take total, uncontested ownership of a highly lucrative $50 million architectural firm for a completely insignificant fraction of its actual worth. Monica would legally pocket the $2 million corporate buyout, completely empty Bradley's remaining personal bank accounts, and rapidly sell off their luxurious Lincoln Park estate. They would divide the massive financial spoils of their psychological warfare and run off together. They were planning to live a permanent life of extreme luxury built entirely on the chemically induced destruction of a brilliant, incredibly trusting man. Bradley would be left rotting away in a sterile psychiatric ward, permanently lobotomized by heavy synthetic antipsychotics, completely bankrupt, and entirely abandoned by the people he loved the most. The meticulous, predatory synchronization of Monica's domestic poisoning and Gregory's corporate manipulation was a dark symphony of pure, unadulterated evil. They had seamlessly weaponized the complex law, the trusting medical establishment, and the sacred, intimate bonds of marriage and friendship to execute the perfect heist. I slowly closed the heavy legal binder, the sharp sound echoing loudly in the quiet study. They honestly thought they had accounted for every single potential variable. They truly believed they had isolated Bradley completely. But they had made one fatal, highly catastrophic miscalculation in their arrogant planning. They forgot about the father who built the empire they were desperately trying to steal. The 70-year-old shark they had dismissed as a clueless, grieving old man was fully prepared to completely decimate their entire existence. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Thomas's number. The time for silent observation was officially over. It was finally time to trap the predators in their own meticulously constructed cage. I needed to act swiftly before Gregory could file any corporate motions, or Monica could realize that her poison bottles had been compromised and swapped. I walked over to the large bay window of my study, staring out at the dark Chicago skyline. The towering skyscrapers in the distance were monuments to ambition, but I knew intimately the cutthroat savagery required to erect them. Gregory and Monica believed they had mastered that very same ruthlessness. They were profoundly mistaken. I spent the remainder of the night meticulously drafting a comprehensive legal counteroffensive. I reached out to a trusted network of independent medical professionals, securing the necessary support to immediately override her fraudulent holistic diagnosis the very moment the trap was sprung. I reviewed every single financial document, ensuring my aggressive strategy was absolutely foolproof and completely airtight. There would be no lengthy court battles or prolonged legal negotiations. I was going to execute a precise, devastating ambush that would instantly sever their control and permanently expose their immense corporate fraud. The rising sun slowly illuminated the quiet city streets, casting long, sharp shadows across my mahogany desk. My son was going to survive this nightmare, and those two treacherous predators were going to lose absolutely everything they had stolen. By Wednesday morning, my counteroffensive was fully operational. I had spent the previous 48 hours moving vast amounts of capital and calling in every single high-level favor I had accumulated over 4 decades in the Chicago commercial real estate sector. I retained a completely independent, highly aggressive corporate litigation firm, bypassing anyone who had ever crossed paths with Gregory. I also secured a prominent judge, a man whose absolute integrity I had personally vouched for during a brutal political smear campaign a decade prior to place an immediate silent injunction on any transfer of assets related to Harrison Architectural Associates. Gregory and Monica were effectively trapped inside a frozen financial vault. They just did not know the heavy steel doors had already been locked from the outside. Thomas and his private surveillance team tracked Gregory's every single movement. We knew precisely when the treacherous lawyer withdrew a massive sum of cash, undoubtedly the bribe money meant for a corrupt notary public. We intercepted the digital calendar invites Gregory sent to Monica. The execution date was set for Friday evening at 8 o'clock. They planned to finalize the corporate theft under the cover of the weekend, giving the banks and legal institutions 2 full days of administrative silence before the massive transfer of power could possibly be flagged or contested by anyone. Friday night descended upon the city with a heavy, suffocating humidity. I sat in the back of Thomas's unmarked surveillance van, parked discreetly down the street from the Lincoln Park estate. My heart hammered a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were completely still. Beside me sat 2 off-duty federal marshals Thomas had brought in, men who specialized in executing high-risk corporate warrants. We watched the live feed from the microscopic audio bugs Thomas had managed to plant near the front door and dining room earlier that week. At precisely 7:45, a sleek silver sedan pulled into the long driveway. The heavy iron gates, operated remotely by Monica, swung open instantly. Gregory stepped out of the vehicle, smoothing the lapels of his expensive tailored suit. He was accompanied by a nervous-looking older man carrying a thick leather briefcase the corrupt notary public they had purchased to bless their massive fraud. Gregory walked up the stone steps with the arrogant, unhurried stride of a man who believed he was about to conquer the world. He pressed the doorbell, and the heavy mahogany door opened immediately. Monica greeted him with a soft, triumphant laugh. I listened through the audio receiver as their voices echoed in the grand foyer. The microphone picked up the disgusting sound of their brief, familiar kiss. "Is he ready?" Gregory asked, his voice dripping with eager anticipation. "He is perfectly compliant," Monica replied smoothly. "I gave him a double dose of his special smoothie an hour ago. He can barely hold his own head up. He will sign exactly where we tell him to sign, and by Monday morning we will own absolutely everything. Let us get this over with quickly. I want to celebrate properly." My blood boiled hot and lethal, but I forced myself to wait. We needed them to physically present the fraudulent documents. We needed the corrupt notary to formally begin the illegal authorization process. I stepped out of the surveillance van, signaling Thomas and the marshals to follow me. We moved silently across the manicured lawn, approaching the front of the house. I bypassed the main entrance and led the men directly toward the large bay windows of the formal dining room, the exact spot where I had witnessed my son being poisoned just days before. I pressed myself against the cold stone facade and peered through the narrow gap in the heavy velvet curtains. The scene playing out beneath the glowing crystal chandelier was a sickening tableau of pure greed. Bradley was seated at the head of the heavy mahogany table. Because I had successfully swapped the toxic vials for harmless herbal supplements. Earlier in the week, my son was not actually heavily sedated. He was experiencing a rapid, agonizing withdrawal from the synthetic antipsychotics, his body fighting through the terrible residual fog. He was slumped forward, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were darting nervously around the room, registering the severe danger, even if he could not fully articulate it. Monica stood directly behind him, her hands resting possessively on his shoulders, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into his tailored shirt. Gregory stood across the table, laying out the thick stacks of dense legal paperwork, The corrupt notary sat nervously to the side, already stamping his official seal onto the blank signature pages, completely ignoring the fact that the signatory was visibly impaired. "This is the final hurdle, old friend," Gregory said, his voice laced with a sickening, mocking warmth as he looked down at Bradley. "I just need your signature right here on the bottom line. It is a simple administrative transfer. It will take all the heavy stress completely off your shoulders. You just need to rest now." Monica leaned down, pressing her face against Bradley's ear. "Come on, darling," she cooed, her voice sweet and deeply venomous. "Do it for me. Just sign the papers so you can go back to sleep." She picked up a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from the table and forcefully pressed it into Bradley's trembling right hand. She gripped his wrist with her own hand, preparing to physically guide his fingers across the dotted line. Gregory tapped the paper impatiently, pushing the buyout agreement directly under Bradley's face. The document that would legally surrender a $50 million architectural empire for a pathetic $2 million. Bradley groaned, a raw, primal sound of pure resistance escaping his throat. He tried to pull his hand back, his knuckles turning white as he fought against Monica's surprisingly strong grip. His sheer willpower was fighting through the chemical residue, desperately trying to protect the legacy I had built for him. But Monica was relentless. She tightened her grip, pushing the gold pen downward, until the sharp metallic nib hovered a mere fraction of an inch above the thick legal paper. The dark ink was seconds away from permanently staining the document. I did not wait another heartbeat. I turned to the federal marshals standing beside me in the dark and gave a sharp, decisive nod. We did not bother with the discreet service entrance or the quiet patio door. We moved directly to the massive, solid oak front doors of the grand foyer. Thomas stepped forward, wielding a heavy tactical breaching ram he had retrieved from the van. With one massive, incredibly violent swing, he drove the heavy steel ram directly into the center of the double doors. The deafening sound of shattering wood and snapping metal hinges echoed like a bomb blast through the quiet, affluent neighborhood. The heavy wooden doors blew completely open, crashing violently against the bright interior walls of the completely pristine foyer. I immediately stepped through the ruined entryway, my posture rigid, my eyes locked directly on the dining room archway, entirely ready to completely and utterly destroy them. The heavy mahogany doors splintered into jagged fragments that rained across the polished marble floor. Gregory and Monica froze, paralyzed by the deafening sound and the sudden violent intrusion into their secluded sanctuary. I strode through the arched doorway of the formal dining room, my wet overcoat dripping onto the expensive Persian rug. I was not alone. Flanking me were two senior federal agents from the Financial Crimes and Domestic Terrorism Task Force, their dark windbreakers, a stark contrast to the sterile elegance of the room. Close behind them, a team of emergency medical technicians rushed into the space, moving with immediate, practiced urgency toward my son. Gregory dropped his heavy leather briefcase. It hit the floor with a dull thud, spilling pristine copies of the fraudulent corporate buyout agreements. Monica gasped, taking a sudden step backward away from Bradley, her hands instinctively flying to cover her mouth. Her perfectly manicured facade was instantly shattered by the sheer, overwhelming force of our unannounced arrival. The corrupt notary public scrambled out of his chair, knocking it backward as he desperately raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Secure the perimeter and detain the individuals," the lead federal agent ordered, his voice echoing with absolute uncompromising authority. The second agent moved swiftly around the large mahogany table, positioning himself directly between Gregory and the front exit. The paramedics immediately surrounded Bradley. One technician quickly checked his pulse while another gently lifted his chin, examining his dilated pupils and shallow breathing. I watched as they carefully wrapped a stabilizing cuff around his arm, speaking to him in low, soothing tones. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" Monica demanded, her voice shrill and trembling as she frantically tried to regain her composure. "William, you cannot break in here. This is a private medical matter regarding my husband," she continued, her chest heaving with panic. "You are trespassing." I ignored her frantic screeching and walked deliberately to the head of the long dining table. I looked down at the fraudulent corporate transfer documents, noting the gold fountain pen resting exactly where Monica had dropped it. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the thick, heavily sealed manila envelope Thomas had delivered just hours ago. I raised it high in the air and brought it down violently onto the polished wood, the sharp smack silencing Monica instantly. "There are no private medical matters occurring in this room," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, lethal resonance. I reached into the envelope and pulled out the thick toxicology report, sliding it directly across the table until it rested against the corrupt buyout agreement. "This is conclusive. This is a comprehensive forensic molecular analysis of the holistic wellness supplements you have been feeding my son," I continued relentlessly. "The laboratory has completely confirmed the presence of highly concentrated synthetic haloperidol and severe fast-acting muscle relaxants. You are not treating executive burnout, Monica. You are actively administering a slow chemical lobotomy to deliberately induce permanent cognitive incapacitation." Monica lost all remaining color in her face. Her skin turned a sickly ashen gray, and her mouth opened and closed in silent, suffocating panic. She looked frantically toward Gregory, silently begging the brilliant corporate lawyer to conjure a magical legal defense. Gregory straightened his suit jacket, desperately trying to project the arrogant confidence that had defined his entire career. "William, you are making wildly libelous accusations," Gregory stammered, a thin bead of sweat forming on his forehead. "You are emotionally compromised by this highly unfortunate neurological decline. As the acting corporate counsel for Harrison Architectural Associates, I must warn you that these aggressive actions constitute severe tortious interference." Gregory pushed on his voice, gaining a fraction of its usual authority. "I am simply here to facilitate a legal transfer of power under a valid, legally binding, durable power of attorney." I did not break my icy stare. I reached back into the thick envelope and pulled out the stack of glossy surveillance photographs. I fanned them out across the table, completely covering the fraudulent corporate contracts. The bright, high-resolution images of Gregory and Monica kissing passionately in the secluded courtyard of the boutique hotel gleamed under the crystal chandelier. "You are not facilitating a corporate transfer," Gregory thus replied smoothly, watching his eyes widen in absolute horror as he recognized the damning photographs. "You are actively executing a highly coordinated $50 million corporate heist. You engineered a fraudulent power of attorney, buried a predatory incapacity clause in the partnership agreement, and conspired with your romantic partner to completely steal the majority stake for a pathetic $2 million. Gregory took a shaky step backward. His knees buckled slightly, and he reached out to grip the back of a heavy wooden chair to prevent himself from collapsing completely onto the floor. The arrogant, untouchable lawyer was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, deeply compromised criminal, realizing his entire life was completely over. He looked down at the photographs, his mind desperately calculating the overwhelming mountain of undeniable legal evidence I had systematically compiled against him. "You underestimated the clueless old man," I stated coldly, repeating the exact insulting phrase he had foolishly uttered in his private office. I was not playing golf or mourning quietly in the shadows. I was actively tracking absolutely everything. I was tracking every single wire transfer, auditing every shell corporation, and securing federal injunctions to permanently freeze every single asset associated with your fraudulent enterprise. You are completely trapped. The lead federal agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "Gregory Harrison," he announced firmly, "you are under arrest for massive corporate wire fraud, severe financial extortion, and active criminal conspiracy. Monica Harrison, you are under arrest for the attempted murder and systemic poisoning of your legally bound spouse, alongside massive corporate fraud." Monica let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She lunged toward the table, desperately trying to snatch the glossy photographs and the toxicology report, as if destroying the physical paper could somehow erase her horrific crimes. The second agent caught her wrists effortlessly, twisting her arms behind her back and securing the cold steel cuffs around her trembling wrists. She sobbed violently, the heavy mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Her glamorous, highly curated facade was completely washed away, leaving nothing but a desperate, terrified prisoner. Gregory did not fight back. He simply stared blankly at the ruined mahogany door, his mind completely shattered by the absolute precision of my devastating ambush. The corrupt notary public was quietly detained by a responding police officer who had just arrived at the front door. The man offered no resistance, eagerly babbling about cooperating fully with the prosecution in exchange for simple leniency. I turned my back on the pathetic criminals and focused entirely on my son. The paramedics had successfully stabilized his vital signs and were preparing to move him onto a mobile stretcher. Bradley looked up at me, his eyes fighting through the heavy chemical fog that had trapped him for weeks. He blinked slowly. The absolute nightmare was officially over. We had won absolutely everything back today. The heavy silence of the dining room was quickly replaced by the urgent, organized chaos of the highly trained medical team. The lead paramedic, a burly man with calm, reassuring eyes, carefully secured Bradley onto the mobile stretcher. He barked rapid instructions to his partner, detailing the immediate need for a specialized intravenous detox unit to safely flush the massive accumulation of synthetic haloperidol from my son's compromised nervous system. I stepped back, giving them the necessary space to maneuver the heavy stretcher through the ruined archway and out toward the flashing red and white lights of the waiting ambulance. Bradley's head rolled slightly to the side as they moved him, and for a brief fleeting second, his eyes met mine. The profound terror that had clouded his vision for weeks was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, exhausted gratitude. I gave him a single, reassuring nod, silently promising that I would handle the remaining wreckage of his shattered life. As the medical team rushed my son to safety, the federal agents forcefully escorted Gregory and Monica out of the grand estate. I followed them out onto the expansive, rain-slicked driveway, watching the final pathetic act of their shattered conspiracy unfold under the harsh glare of the police cruisers. The cold reality of their imminent incarceration had finally pierced their arrogant delusions, and their supposedly unbreakable partnership instantly dissolved into vicious, desperate self-preservation. Monica twisted wildly against the tight grip of the federal agent, her soaked designer gown clinging awkwardly to her trembling frame. She screamed hysterically, her voice echoing loudly across the wealthy, manicured neighborhood, entirely abandoning any pretense of sophisticated grace. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at Gregory, frantically shrieking that the entire corporate theft was his exclusive design. She loudly claimed she was merely a naive, terrified wife who had been heavily manipulated and deeply coerced by the brilliant, predatory attorney. She wept loudly, begging the stoic agents to believe she had absolutely no knowledge of the lethal chemical composition of the holistic supplements he had allegedly provided. Gregory did not accept her desperate betrayal with quiet dignity. The polished, untouchable corporate lawyer completely lost his composure, his face twisting into an ugly, furious snarl. He spat venomous accusations right back at her, his voice hoarse and cracking with pure panic. He loudly declared that the poisoning was entirely her malicious invention, that she was a black widow who had actively seduced him to gain access to his intimate legal knowledge. He desperately offered to testify against her, begging the lead investigator to grant him full immunity in exchange for exposing her hidden offshore bank accounts and her extensive history of previous financial grifts. They stood in the pouring rain, two cornered predators viciously tearing each other apart to save their own skin. I stood quietly on the top step of the grand portico, completely untouched by the raging storm, watching with profound, icy satisfaction as the heavy doors of the separate police cruisers slammed shut, permanently sealing them inside their new steel cages. The next 30 days were a grueling, relentless uphill battle, but it was a war fought in the bright light of day, entirely free from the suffocating shadows of their deception. I spent my days coordinating with the district attorney, ensuring the mountain of forensic and financial evidence was meticulously cataloged for their impending federal trial. There would be no lenient plea deals and no quiet settlements. They were facing decades in federal prison for conspiracy wire fraud and the systematic attempted murder of my son. I spent my nights at the specialized rehabilitation clinic, sitting quietly beside Bradley as his body and mind slowly agonizingly purged the toxic chemical residue. It was a deeply harrowing process. There were days of severe muscle tremors, intense physical pain, and overwhelming emotional exhaustion as his brilliant mind fully reawakened to the horrific reality of his wife's ultimate betrayal. But my son was a fighter. He had my blood, my resilience, and my unyielding determination. Slowly, the heavy gray pallor faded completely from his skin. His posture regained its natural, confident strength. The sharp, analytical spark returned to his eyes, burning brighter and more intensely than ever before. He spent hours talking with the medical staff, completely rebuilding his cognitive stamina, and hours talking with me, slowly processing the sheer magnitude of the deception that had occurred inside his own home. He did not break under the weight of the realization. Instead, the betrayal forged a new, impenetrable layer of hardened steel around his heart. He was no longer the trusting, overly optimistic architect who easily handed over the keys to his kingdom. He was a survivor completely awakened to the ruthless realities of the world. Exactly 1 month after the devastating ambush at the Lincoln Park estate, the heavy glass doors of Harrison Architectural Associates opened to welcome its true leader back. I walked alongside Bradley down the busy executive corridor, observing the genuine relief and profound respect in the eyes of the dedicated staff. They had been informed of the corporate restructuring, the removal of their corrupt legal counsel, and the temporary medical leave of their visionary founder. Now he was back, walking with a steady, commanding stride that instantly silenced any lingering whispers of corporate instability. We entered the expansive, sunlit chief executive suite, the very room where Gregory had once plotted to steal an entire empire from behind his polished mahogany desk. Bradley walked over to his massive drafting table, running his hands over the smooth surface, reconnecting with the physical reality of his life's work. He looked healthy, sharp, and entirely present. He turned to me, a quiet, understanding smile touching the corners of his mouth. He gestured gracefully toward the heavy leather chair positioned at the absolute head of the executive conference table. I did not hesitate. I walked over and took my seat, feeling the familiar comforting weight of corporate command settle firmly over my shoulders. We had an immense amount of work to do. We needed to launch a comprehensive internal audit, completely purge the legal department of any residual corruption tied to Gregory, and aggressively rebuild the firm's administrative structure from the ground up to ensure no single individual could ever exploit the company again. The massive $50 million empire was entirely safe, secure, and completely restored to its rightful owner. The predatory threat had been entirely neutralized, locked away behind cold federal bars where they could never manipulate or destroy another human life. But the deep psychological scars of this terrifying ordeal would remain with both of us for the rest of our lives. They would serve as a permanent, chilling reminder of the catastrophic cost of blind trust and a powerful testament to the absolute lengths a father will go to protect his own blood. I opened the first clean financial ledger, picked up my silver pen, and looked across the table at my son. We were ready to begin again. Trust is a foundational pillar of family, but blind trust is a luxury no man who has built an empire can afford. The truth is often hiding in plain sight, masked by sweet words and plausible excuses. This ordeal taught me that true love for your child sometimes means suspecting those closest to them. When your gut tells you something is wrong, do not ignore it to keep the peace. Investigate, verify, and prepare for the worst. Betrayal rarely comes from enemies. It comes from those holding the keys to your home. Protect your blood always. Did this story make your blood boil? If you've ever dealt with toxic in-laws or had to fight to protect your family, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Leave a comment below, letting me know where you're watching from and what you would have done.
Oh thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.